I didn't think we would get such a good view of the gate. Roland looked out into the distance where a large gate had been built. Such places were usually considered strategic military locations, but this one seemed to have been developed as a kind of tourist attraction. I suppose you wouldn't know, Arthur said as he walked a few steps ahead and gestured for Roland and Mary to follow. This whole terrace was constructed for that purpose. Roland raised an eyebrow. I see, are they making it a spectacle? Arthur paused and looked toward the other viewing platforms that extended into the distance. Several buildings appeared to have been placed in carefully chosen positions to give people a clear view of those passing through the gate. Now that Roland was here, it was obvious that this had been done with intention. Indeed. It's a way to show the prestige of the Valyrian house. Not many can afford to use a high-tier teleportation gate. When one of the noble heirs returns, the family wants the entire city to see it. They want people to witness the power and wealth of those who command such magic. Roland nodded. Although the gate was probably not used often and might seem like a waste of resources, it still served a clear purpose. It stood as a symbol of the Valyrian lineage, a statement that they possessed enough wealth and influence to build a gate wherever they pleased. They stood on one of the viewing platforms overlooking the gate, positioned farther away from the main plaza. Other noble families had already reserved the closer platforms, but they hadn't wanted to be too close anyway. Arthur still seemed uneasy about his brothers and preferred not to be seen by them when they arrived. I don't see Brother Ivan anywhere, but maybe that's for the best. Before long, they settled into the restaurant attached to the platform and took the opportunity to sip some tea. Arthur glanced around, searching for the familiar flash of Ivan's red hair, but saw no sign of him. It was clear he hadn't come to greet his brothers, and the reason didn't need much explanation. After his mistake, I reckon he doesn't want to see someone he once considered beneath him and worth arriving. Roland said, now standing near the edge of the terrace. Arthur gave a quiet nod. That's probably it. The time for the arrival was drawing near. Roland straightened his posture and fell silent, slipping into the composed demeanor expected of a knight. Moments later, the gate began to exude magical energy. There was movement near its base as a group of armored men assembled to welcome whoever was about to arrive. In the distance, the runic patterns glowed across the stone platform. Runic was the primary magical language used for these constructs, and because of that, Roland was starting to understand what to look for when interacting with the gates. Although it was not easy, he felt confident that he could take control of the gate if they ever needed to escape. Watching it activate now would only help him speed up that process if the situation ever arose. Arthur's hands tightened around his teacup, and even Mary, who was usually unreadable, narrowed her eyes. The gate erupted in its usual water-like energy, forming a pathway, and finally people began to appear. Some of the onlookers gasped, raising their voices in surprise. Children pointed and laughed as the first figures stepped through. Just as it had been when Arthur arrived, the first to emerge were personal mounted soldiers. The horses they rode looked unusual, larger than normal, with strange gems embedded in their foreheads. It was clear these were not ordinary mounts but magical beasts, each comparable in strength to a Tier 2 class holder. So it was true, he has a fondness for magic. Roland kept the thought to himself as a large number of soldiers and magical beasts continued to cross through. Eventually, a carriage similar to Arthur's appeared. This one was covered in glyphs and sigils, radiating magical power that matched the forces around it. Brother Tybalt's forces leave quite an impression, don't they? Indeed. Roland replied, glancing back at the readings. Mana from the gate still lingered in the air, but even despite it, he could sense that nearly everyone in the group carried a significant amount of magical energy. Tybalt Valyrian was affiliated with a magical academy and had reportedly graduated at the top of his class. He had a clear preference for magic users and was known for surrounding himself with individuals who possessed mana-based classes. Our Lord's carriage was much better. Mary spoke in an irritated tone, as if she didn't want her lord to fall behind his brother. The two were close in age, with Tybalt being older by just a year. Roland didn't know the exact nature of their relationship, but it was clear that Arthur wasn't pleased to see the man who had just stepped out of the carriage. The newcomer appeared elegant and refined, yet there was something undeniably vain about him. Tybalt Valyrian descended from his carriage with profound grace, moving as though he had rehearsed each step for this very moment. He was slightly taller and far more slender than Arthur. His features were striking, almost like a portrait rather than a real man, and his limbs were long and poised. His robe flowed in a cascade of azure silk with intricate silver embroidery. What caught Roland's attention most was his hair, which shimmered under the morning sun in shifting shades of blue, almost glowing with light. Could it be because of his mana? Perhaps he was a water mage. The sight reminded Roland of Lucille, who specialized in ice magic. Mages with strong elemental affinities often experienced physical changes. Blue hair, blue eyes, or even bark-like skin were not uncommon. Some families even established lineages to preserve these affinities across generations. Now that he had seen this fourth brother, Roland could tell that Arthur and the others didn't share the same mothers. This was true for all of the brothers and explained why their struggle to become the sole heir was so intense. All of them shared the same father, a man their mothers desperately curried favor with. Only one of the brothers could become the next duke, and this drove them into constant conflict. To many, the noble lords were figures to be envied, but to Roland, they evoked only pity. Each of them longed for their father's recognition and were pushed by both circumstance and their own mothers to turn against one another. Once a new duke was chosen, the others would either be forced to leave the island forever or submit to his rule, or perhaps even perish. He seems to like the attention. Tybalt paused at the base of the stairs leading from the gate, allowing the crowd to absorb the full spectacle of his arrival. His entourage formed a semicircle behind him, armed and armored in a mix of ceremonial and practical gear. Mages, knights, and magical beasts moved in tight formation. Although most of them would be sent to the outer castle district, their presence here was clearly intended to display his prestige. Tybalt raised one hand, not to greet the crowd, but to quiet the applause that had begun to ripple through the noble viewing platforms. His pale blue eyes scanned the terraces. He did not linger, but Roland noticed the brief moment when Tybalt's gaze reached their section. His expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of recognition, quickly replaced by indifference. He saw us. Arthur exhaled slowly, clearly affected by the way his brother brushed past them without a word. Tybalt returned to his carriage and then continued, his large entourage following as he made his way toward one of the grander mansions. A crowd began to form behind him, eager to speak with one of the top 3 contenders for the ducal seat. It was a stark contrast to the silence and disinterest that had surrounded them just the day before. "My brother is quite popular, isn't he?" "It does seem so, my lord, but I don't believe he is the most popular," Roland answered while gazing into the distance. One brother had arrived, but 2 more were still expected. Next in line was Theodore Valerian, a figure they were more familiar with. After an hour-long pause, the gate stirred once again, and another group began to make their way through. Where Tybalt's entrance had felt like a grand theatrical performance, this new arrival was colder, darker, and far more grounded. There was no fanfare in Theodore Valerian's approach. No mages in brilliant robes. No applause or idle chatter from the nobles. The atmosphere shifted as everyone turned their attention to the armored men marching in perfect formation, their movements precise and almost mechanical. This brother's presence carried a different motif. For reasons no one fully understood, he favored the raven, and some even joked that the nickname suited him because of his sharp, beak-like nose. His carriage was pitch black and almost completely devoid of ornamentation. In place of luxury, it bore defensive enchantments, the Valerian crest, and a large sculpted bird's head jutting from the front. His knights wore darkened armor that was heavily enchanted, making it difficult to gauge their true power even for someone like Roland. At the front rode a strange-looking armored man. His armor was pitch black, and his pauldrons were shaped like bear heads. He had a massive stature, one that only someone of the Goliath race could naturally possess. Although no weapon was visibly carried, Roland could assume it was something large and heavy. A long cape fluttered behind him as he advanced in silence, and the aura of death he carried was quite obvious. "So that's the infamous bestial warden. People say he has slaughtered thousands of beasts and barbarians in his lifetime," Arthur commented again as the march continued. The soldiers never stopped, they didn't speak, nor did they glance in their direction. It was a silent and solemn display, yet the man leading them had earned the favor of many nobles and merchants. While not as many people seemed interested in following him, those who did were of higher status and greater prestige. "That's quite something, that man is dangerous. Will I have to fight him in the future?" Roland thought to himself as he observed the man who appeared to be the most powerful among those in Theodore's service. There were other knight commanders present, but none matched the one who rode at the front of the formation. It was an impressive show of strength, and this force seemed more capable than the previous one, though in a more traditional manner, as it lacked the same number of spellcasters. Even so, this brother was considered second only to one other, and that man would soon make his appearance. Julius Valerian. He is said to be at the top, the best candidate for Duke with just one major flaw. Rumors surrounded him. He was the firstborn and had used his early advantage to secure his current position. All of the brothers seemed capable in their own way, but Roland was eager to see the one who was said to embody the ideal noble. Another hour passed, and soon the gate pulsed again, signaling his arrival. The gate shimmered, not violently, but with an elegance none of the previous arrivals had displayed. The glow was softer, more refined, and the color of the mana shifted from the usual blue to a rich gold, reminiscent of Solarian holy magic. The crowd erupted in cheers, louder than when Tybalt had appeared. But this time, there was something else in the air: prayer. Robed figures emerged first, carrying the banners of both the Valyrian household and the Solarian church. This was Julius's greatest flaw. He was a pious man, deeply involved with the church, and he would almost certainly elevate it to prominence if he became the new duke. The initial group was a blend of knights and clergy, presenting a deliberate image of unity between the Valyrians and the Solarian church, as if declaring that this alliance represented the future. As soon as he appeared, a wave of reverence swept across the terrace. Even nobles who typically scoffed at the church offered solemn nods of respect. His army did not appear as grand as Tybalt's nor as intimidating as Theodore's, yet the presence they commanded was undeniable and far greater, all because of one man on a white horse. Julius Valerian passed through the Golden Gate like a figure from legend. His long golden hair flowed like sunlight, catching the morning light and casting a soft shimmer around him. His eyes were bright, clear, and golden like the rising sun, giving him an otherworldly warmth. The aura he carried was immense, and his golden armor evoked the image of the highest paladins. From what I know, he is an honorary paladin. Because of his status, he was never allowed to officially join the church as one of their own, but not like that matters. Roland watched as his favorite zealots stepped beyond the gate. The golden mana was nothing more than a spectacle, a carefully crafted display meant to captivate. This was Julius's greatest weakness. He was a man clearly influenced by the Solarian church. Although it was not forbidden for him to be affiliated with them, his deep ties made it unlikely that he would ever separate himself from their influence. His official class remained a mystery, but it was almost certainly that of a Solarian paladin. Roland could sense it, holy mana radiated from him. That's quite the aura he carries. It quickly became clear why this person was in the lead. The people were mesmerized by his appearance and apparent goodness. Even Arthur, who was sitting next to him, could not help but stare. There was a certain presence this man carried, one that naturally drew attention. He stood in stark contrast to the second brother, Theodore, who came across as a villain by comparison. That marked the end of the entrance for all the Valyrian brothers. Julius did not make any dramatic gestures, instead, he simply waved to the crowd while stepping down from the teleportation gate. Soon, the rest of the onlookers began to rush forward, leaving only a few who remained behind without going to greet any of the brothers. "You've got some tough competition." Roland tried to break the silence with a light joke, but it went unnoticed. Arthur simply nodded, looking defeated. Maybe it was a mistake to come here. Roland glanced sideways at him. Arthur clearly wasn't himself. His heart was racing and his face had gone pale. Whatever memories had surfaced after seeing his brothers again, they had left a mark. He wasn't handling it well. It wasn't surprising that he was having second thoughts, but it was already too late to back out. They couldn't leave the city without taking part in the assembly, and Arthur knew that. It's too late for that now. Without saying more, Roland stepped closer and placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. It was a simple calming spell, one that eased his nerves and slowed his heartbeat. Arthur's breathing began to steady, and after a moment, he responded. "Ah. You're right, there's no turning back now. Let's just head home for now." Arthur replied in a weak tone, his shoulders slumping forward. Mary opened the door, and they walked out without exchanging another word. Their pace was slow, and in the distance, the shouting of the other Valyrian brothers only made things worse. It was clear that Arthur was not handling the situation well, but Roland had no idea what to say to make him feel better. When they returned, it became even more obvious how little anyone expected from them. No one was waiting. Not even a single merchant approached Arthur to offer his services. It felt as if the future had already been decided, and there was no chance left for victory. "I'm being underestimated, always underestimated," Arthur mumbled to himself as they stepped through the doors of the mansion. Once inside, he stopped and stared at Roland with a strange look in his eyes. "Hit me." "What?" "Just hit me." Mary looked startled as Arthur turned to Roland with the unusual command. The knights stood still, unwilling to lift a hand against their lord, but Roland had made no vow that stopped him. Without warning, his hand struck Arthur's face, sending him flying several meters across the room and crashing to the ground. "Lord Arthur!" Mary cried out in panic, but Arthur did not get up. He stayed on the ground, motionless. Then, instead of groaning, he began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and grew into something louder, more genuine. As he sat up, he wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and grinned like a madman. "I needed that. Thank you, my friend." Mary stood speechless, unable to respond. Roland remained where he was, unmoving, watching as Arthur's composure returned. The spark in his eyes had come back. That hunger to prove himself was still alive, and now that it had been reignited, it was time to show everyone that Arthur Valerian was also someone who deserved to be an heir. "Lord Nathaniel Pembroke and Lady Eleanor Pembroke." The herald's voice rang out across the wide stone courtyard, echoing against the towering walls of the inner keep. The main gate of Valerian Castle loomed ahead. It was a fortress within a fortress, its colossal doors clad in black steel and reinforced with runic enchantments that shimmered faintly under the morning sun. Roland had seen fortified gates before, but this was different. It was not merely a barrier to keep enemies out. It was also a statement of power and a declaration of who was allowed to enter and who was not. The approach narrowed to a single broad ramp flanked by arrow slits and murder holes, with armored sentries standing at attention every few paces. The enchantments woven into the walls contained a form of magical scanning that began to flicker as the next lord approached. "Halt!" Armored men stepped out in front of the Pembroke carriage, their halberds lowering in perfect unison to bar the path. The herald faltered mid-sentence as a ripple of pale blue light ran across the outer arch of the gate, the telltale shimmer of the detection wards flaring brighter. "Magical item detected." One of the guards barked, his voice devoid of any respect. The Pembroke driver froze and glanced back toward the noble couple within. From the shadows of the carriage, Lord Nathaniel's voice rang out, sharp with indignation. "This is an outrage. We are invited guests of the Duke himself. Then you will have nothing to fear." The lead guard replied without even looking at him. He motioned with 2 fingers, and a squad stepped forward, 4 in front and 4 behind. Their armor was engraved with runes and other enchantments designed to protect them from potential attackers and uncooperative guests. Even though the noble made no move to exit, the guards pulled the door open. The Pembrokes were all but ushered into the open. Lady Eleanor clutched her fan so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her composure cracking under the gaze of other nobles who watched from their own carriages. The inspection began immediately. Trunks and cases were hauled down, their locks undone with an efficiency that suggested this was not the first such search that morning. The soldiers handled silks and jewelry roughly, pausing only when a faint glow pulsed from within a velvet-lined box. Once it came into view, the glow intensified, prompting the lead guard to raise his brow. "Restricted enchantment," he declared, lifting the small crystalline sphere inside. "Possession of this requires written sanction from the Valerian court. Do you have such papers?" Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "No, but it is just a communication crystal used to contact my family. You cannot seriously be thinking about taking it away," he said, but the soldiers did not seem to care. "It is now confiscated," the guard said flatly. He then placed the sphere into a steel case carried by another soldier, who immediately snapped the locks shut. "Once the assembly is over, you may take your possessions back." The search continued, turning up a dagger with a concealed frost rune and a ring that radiated faintly with stored mana. Both were taken without discussion. Only when the guards were satisfied did they step aside. "You may proceed." The Pembrokes re-entered their carriage in silence, humiliation plain on their faces as the onlookers whispered behind gloved hands. The giant black doors of the inner keep groaned open, just wide enough for a single carriage to pass. From the carriage directly behind them, Roland leaned back and processed what had just happened. "There is an anti-magical field around the gate. This will be troublesome. The Valerians are not taking chances." The day of the assembly had arrived, and Arthur and Roland were heading into the inner sanctum of the Valerian house. The inner castle was the most heavily defended area on the island. It contained its own mage tower, its own army, and an array of magical defenses. Even though Roland had managed to create a monitoring zone within Albrook, he knew that his own work could not compare to what he was witnessing here. He could not see beyond the walls because an anti-magical barrier surrounded them, making it impossible. The barrier only affected the outer layer, which meant he would be able to cast spells inside if he wished. However, escaping through it would be far more difficult. He also had no idea how many similar zones might exist within the castle grounds. Next. While he was lost in thought, the carriage began to move forward. The coachmen had been assigned from their temporary mansion. Mary, Gareth, and Warren had to remain in the middle district and were instructed to wait for their return. The assembly was scheduled to last the entire day until late at night, although it could be extended depending on how events unfolded. All 4 of Arthur's brothers had already entered before him, but they were treated in the same manner. The order of entry was the reverse of their teleportation gate arrival, with Julius going in first before any other noble, and Yvonne entering fourth. The only one still outside was Arthur, and only a few others remained behind him. Even though they did not attract much attention, this did not mean that the guards would be lenient with their belongings, and he needed to make sure nothing important was confiscated. Lord Arthur Valerian. Arthur's name was announced, and Roland noticed his friend gripping his fists tightly. It was clear that Arthur was uncomfortable with the situation and uncertain about what awaited them inside. The recent kidnapping attempt was still fresh in their minds, and it was possible that within the castle their enemies were already plotting against them. The carriage rolled forward at a slow pace. The sound of its wheels grinding against the stone ground was amplified by the silence that had settled over the gate. When the name Valerian was mentioned, the other nobles fell silent. Although Arthur was not well known, many were curious about why he had come here and how someone of illegitimate birth had managed to get this far at all. Halt! As Roland had predicted, the guards stationed outside blocked their way. They surrounded them in the same manner they had other arrivals. He barely registered what they were saying, as his attention was fixed on the anti-magical field surrounding the area, which he was attempting to contain. It is different from the powder, more concentrated and far more powerful. The most common and widespread method of suppressing magic was the use of a special powder prepared by an alchemist. When dispersed into the air, the particles would disrupt the surrounding mana and prevent spells from forming. Other methods existed, however, and in this case the area itself was interfering with the mana flow, rendering even his runic enchantments dormant. When he attempted to channel mana into the runic structure, there was no response, but he did not yet feel concerned. "My lord, please step out of the carriage." The guard outside gestured, and Roland moved to open the carriage door. Roland stepped down. His armor immediately drew attention, and the guards flinched when they realized they were facing a Tier 3 class holder. He remained silent, holding the door open so Arthur could exit. "Gentlemen, I have nothing to hide." Arthur spoke as he stepped out of the carriage. His movements appeared casual, yet each step was carefully measured. He carried himself with the composure of a perfect noble. The lead guard's eyes swept over him from head to toe, then shifted to Roland, lingering just a moment longer than courtesy allowed. "Just be mindful of the leather." The guard gave a brief nod before turning to his men. "Proceed with the inspection." 4 soldiers advanced, the faint glow of enchantments shimmering across their armor as they approached the carriage. Roland stood slightly aside, watching them closely. Their gear had already caught his attention before they had even reached the gate, and now he was trying to determine exactly how it functioned. The anti-magical field did not affect everyone in the same way. These guards wore specialized equipment that allowed them to continue using their magic. Roland focused intently on this, knowing that if he could understand the mechanism behind it, he might be able to counter it. He had spent considerable time in the institute studying the problem, well aware that someone who relied entirely on runic equipment needed a way to operate even in areas where anti-magic was in effect. The guards rummaged quickly through the carriage and even told Arthur to take something out of his pocket. "Restricted item." The man barked as he held up a small crystal pendant with something swirling inside. It was a magical item imbued with a shielding spell. Arthur kept his expression unchanged and handed it over while the search continued. Compared to the inspections of other nobles, this one was far more thorough, and after several dummy items were found, it was finally Roland's turn. "Take off that cape and empty your satchel. Those gauntlets as well." Unlike Arthur, Roland wore a large amount of high-tech enchanted gear. The silvery clasp containing his all-purpose mithril armor was discovered, and the playing cards he had hidden in the carriage were also confiscated. To make matters worse, the man glanced at his helmet and pointed at it. "Take off that helmet. It is a forbidden item." Roland became suspicious. He had made sure to use his rune concealment skill on his entire armor, focusing especially on the helmet. The skill was unaffected by anti-magical fields, so he had assumed it would remain hidden. Stranger still, the guards only confiscated certain items while leaving others untouched, as if they were making educated guesses rather than following their detection devices. "Are they acting on someone's orders?" Roland wondered. It was possible these guards had been bribed by one of his brothers or instructed by the Duke himself. They seemed intent on forcing him to remove pieces of armor, knowing he depended on them for casting spells. Even though he disliked their approach, refusal was not an option. Placing his hands on his knightly helmet, he removed it in full view of everyone present. A ripple of curiosity passed through the gathered nobles as Roland lifted the helmet from his head. Their anticipation quickly gave way to disappointment. Beneath the steel that had hidden his face, there was yet another barrier. A black half-mask made of metal or some other dark material fit snugly over his nose and eyes. The sockets were covered with a reflective surface that completely hid his pupils. His ears were concealed by the material that wrapped around his head like a bandana. Only his jaw and hair were visible while the rest of his face remained obscured. Roland had no desire to reveal his identity here. Although he was not widely known, many recognized his father, and some knew his brothers. The men of the Arden estate shared a strong family resemblance since their father's features always seemed to dominate. Even so, the guard who had forced him to remove the helmet did not appear pleased and continued to shout. "Remove the mask as well!" The guard barked as he stepped forward. His voice was louder this time, clearly calculated to draw the attention of nearby nobles. Several heads turned toward them, eager for another spectacle after the Pembrokes' humiliation. Roland did not move. His gaze, hidden behind reflective lenses, was fixed squarely on the man in front of him. And why should he? This time, it was Arthur who stepped forward to handle the situation. The guard blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Because the Duke's orders are clear." Arthur cut him off. "Your devices have already scanned him. Did they register his mask as a magic item?" He jabbed a finger toward the detection wards over the gate and toward the ones carried by the men. They were circular, shaped like large medallions, and they lit up when near a magical item. Several times earlier, they had failed to react, and Arthur had let it pass. Now that it had come to this, he was forced to intervene. "Please, show me where my knight is at fault." "But if that device does not react?" Arthur lowered his gaze at the man. He was also a Tier 3 class holder and could exert his killing intent when he chose. It was clear that if they continued to harass them, this situation could turn ugly. The guard hesitated, paused in thought, and after a moment replied. "That will not be necessary, my lord. You may pass." Arthur's expression softened into something closer to polite indifference, as if the exchange had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The transformation was so quick it left the watching nobles baffled. "Good, you have my gratitude for your diligence." Arthur spoke smoothly, inclining his head in a gesture that came just short of mocking. The guards stepped back in perfect formation, their halberds lifting in unison. The path to the gates was open again, yet the air around them felt heavy with foreboding. The guards' eyes stayed locked on them, carrying more than mere hostility. Arthur climbed into the carriage first, his composure seemingly intact, but Roland knew better. Outwardly, he looked calm and collected, though deep inside, he was likely screaming. That did not go that badly. Roland nodded without speaking. Here he needed to remember his place, and unless the nobles addressed him directly, it was wiser to hold his tongue. He had lost a few of his belongings, though some remained. His gauntlets were gone, but his boots, with one heel concealing a piece of armor, were still on him. If someone attacked them, he would still have some kind of weapon to defend himself. "I managed to keep 2 of them, I hope it will be enough." Soon, the wheels began to turn, and the gate ahead opened. At last, they were about to enter the proper inner castle area, a place few ever reached. Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on the carriage window through which he could see the castle interior, a place he had visited only a few times in his youth. The carriage rolled forward, its wheels clattering along the cobblestones. Sunlight streamed in shafts through the high, arching walls, each one adorned with banners bearing the Valyrian crest. Beneath those banners, squads of soldiers drilled in precise formations, their armor gleaming like mirrors. "That is quite the welcome." Roland and Arthur remained silent as they passed through the gate. It shut quickly behind them, and at last they could see clearly what lay inside. The wall now stood at their backs, still high and blocking all view and sound from the world beyond. What spread out before them was unexpectedly charming, like a scene lifted from a fairy tale. The carriage rolled into the heart of the inner keep, and Roland blinked in mild disbelief. He had expected a fortress of metal and stone, heavily fortified and bristling with defenses. Instead, he saw a sprawling garden filled with vivid scenery that seemed almost magical. Broad cobblestone paths wound between manicured hedges, each shaped into mythical beasts such as griffins, dragons, and even the rare phoenix. Water from a crystal-clear stream flowed through shallow channels beside the paths, feeding koi ponds whose surfaces shimmered like molten gold in the sunlight. This was the path they followed toward the main keep, which stood amid lush greenery and tranquil scenery. A forest surrounded the castle grounds, and Roland could sense that simple creatures lived within. The space around them had been expanded through spatial magic, similar to what he had experienced in the dungeon area he had just left. Within the forest, he noticed a large tower that seemed to be the focal point of the magic at work here. Not far ahead rose the castle proper, the destination toward which they now traveled. It was large and exquisitely built, the kind of residence befitting a duke. Its towering height was striking, and Roland found himself unable to look away. More walls came into view as they approached the drawbridge and moat. The castle was immense, taller than any building Roland had ever seen, and it rivaled the height of a modern skyscraper. To make the sight even more imposing, there were 7 towers in total. 6 were clearly watchtowers built into the massive outer walls, while the 7th stood at the center and dwarfed the others. This central tower was the Duke's residence and the place where the upcoming assembly would be held. How does it look? The place seems secured quite well. I don't think anything is getting in, and we probably will not be getting out either. Roland whispered, careful to keep his voice low so that no one would catch on to their conversation. Even inside the carriage, from this point forward, no one could be trusted. I see. Arthur nodded as Roland scanned the environment around them. At first, the place seemed magical and tranquil, yet danger lingered everywhere. Several Tier 3 class holders were nearby, many hidden in the forest and around the castle they were approaching. I will not be able to use teleportation gates. We will need to reach the wall. Roland's mind raced with possibilities. He needed to establish an escape plan that would allow them to return home safely if things turned turbulent. Although the Duke himself did not seem to harbor any ulterior motives, the kidnapping attempt had taken place only 2 days earlier. One of the heir candidates might have been responsible and could attempt it again here. The bodies of the assassins he had recovered revealed nothing. At most, he could record their mana patterns in the hope of tracing an old mana signature that had been left behind somewhere. They were unrecognizable, and all their equipment and belongings had been melted by the strange magic they used. This made it difficult to pinpoint their true enemy, and if push came to shove, an escape might be necessary. His helmet was gone now, yet the mask covering his face served a similar purpose. The display that usually spread across his visor was minimized, appearing in a smaller version within his covered eyes. The rune concealment skill was active, and no one had discovered that he was wearing a mostly magical suit of armor. Still, some of his items had been confiscated, most likely because of Arthur's low prestige here. Either one of his brothers had instructed the guards to take them, or the soldiers were simply expressing their disdain for someone who was never going to become the Duke. We are almost there. The carriage clattered across the final stretch of cobblestone, its wheels echoing through the surprising stillness of the seemingly tranquil place. Roland's gaze shifted constantly between the central tower looming ahead and the walls surrounding them. If they needed to escape, he would first have to get out of the main castle. After that he would need to traverse the forest, which seemed to be filled with hidden forces as well as whoever controlled the mage tower. Then he would need to scale the wall and lead himself and the others to one of the teleportation gates. The task seemed impossible, yet he was already working on countermeasures to increase their chances of survival. Arthur, on the other hand, was not concerned with escape. His attention remained fixed entirely on the central castle tower, for that was where his father resided. This would be his first true meeting with him since reaching adulthood. Haha, the Duke's castle is magnificent, isn't it? True, I wish our family could afford something this grand. So true. The silence soon ended as once they traveled across the singular drawbridge, they arrived at the final threshold. The portcullis rose to let them in, and the carriage entered a vast courtyard paved with dark stone. Here, hundreds of nobles, retainers, and servants already bustled about, their colors dazzling like a field of flowers. The murmur of voices echoed as everyone gathered together and chatted. For many, this was a moment they had been waiting for. It was the perfect time to create new deals and get into the good graces of the Duke and his family. The carriage slowed as it entered the main courtyard. An announcer's staff struck the ground with a sharp crack that cut through the noise of the nobles' chatter. Heads turned, eyes drawn to the new arrival. The Valyrian banner was clearly displayed on the carriage, but once the man spoke the name, the interest in their gazes quickly faded. Lord Arthur Valyrian. The name carried across the courtyard, yet the effect was not what one might expect. Heads turned and necks craned. There was curiosity and whispers, but none of the nobles moved toward the carriage. It was as though his very identity pushed them away. To them, a bastard was not worth their time. Roland opened the door first and stepped down, his presence subdued and restrained. Arthur followed. His boots touched the stone softly without sound, and though his expression remained neutral, he felt the weight of every gaze upon him. For a brief moment, silence held the courtyard, as though the crowd were still deciding how to judge him. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, dozens of nobles shifted their attention elsewhere. Their smiles brightened, their steps quickened, and their voices rang with delight as they flocked toward another arrival. Lord Julius Valerian. Ah, Lord Theodore, how resplendent you look. Lord Tybalt, allow me to offer my congratulations in advance. Within moments, the courtyard became a sea of silks and embroidered sleeves surging toward Arthur's brothers. Greetings, compliments, and invitations poured forth, the air alive with laughter. Look at them, swarming like rats. Arthur whispered to Roland, who only nodded in reply. Arthur's exclusion was obvious, though he was not the only one ignored. The third eldest brother, Ivan Valerian, did not fare much better. A small group surrounded him, but his circle was barely half the size of the one gathered around Tybalt. While the nobles continued to give them the cold shoulder, Roland looked around. They were now standing in what resembled a square. The castle had appeared large from the outside, and the impression was just as true once they entered. There was enough space for thousands of people, although most of them were servants. Even though the area was outdoors, it was filled with tables. Some were shaded by large umbrellas that blocked out the sunlight, while others stood fully exposed. Carts carrying food were scattered throughout the place, and servants moved between them with trays of drinks and cakes. Many of the men held glasses of expensive wine, and some were already tipsy from it. We have not even gone inside the main building yet. Roland thought as he followed Arthur, who chose a seat at one of the empty tables. From there, they had a better view of the gathering and could assess the situation more clearly. Brother Julius seems to be the most popular, and Theodore is a close second. I can hardly see them in that crowd. Most of the nobles present had already aligned themselves with the two leading candidates for heir. Even as the minutes passed, no one approached them. It was easy to notice that some people cast glances in their direction, yet none dared to step closer. The reason was clear enough. Anyone who tried would be placing themselves at risk of retaliation. Arthur's standing was still low, and he was not seen as someone capable of protecting his allies, at least not yet. Some do seem interested. The rumors about our victory over Theodore must have spread. Roland said as he leaned over to examine the wine that a servant had placed on their table. Yes, but most likely they do not believe them and will not take the risk. Arthur replied before taking a sip of the expensive wine. Roland noticed that his friend seemed distracted. Although Arthur tried to hide it, his eyes kept darting around the courtyard as if he were searching for someone who was not there. Time passed, yet the person he sought never appeared. May I have the attention of the lords and ladies? By then, everyone had gathered, and a man who looked like a butler finally stepped forward. He stood on a large balcony overlooking the massive courtyard where they had assembled. The place appeared to be intended for the Duke himself to make announcements. Instead, it was the butler who emerged, an elderly man with a mustache and a monocle. Honored guests, by His Grace's command, the castle doors are now open. You are invited to enter the great halls of House Valerian. Please, follow the attendants and make your way to the grand ballroom where refreshments and music await you before the assembly begins. Roland exchanged a glance with Arthur, both silently acknowledging how odd those words sounded. A party before the assembly was strange indeed. The Duke was famous for his tireless devotion to duty, and under normal circumstances, the assembly would take place first, with the celebration for the nobles only afterward. Only then could they converse and discuss matters concerning the island and the kingdom. Perhaps this isn't such a serious gathering and father just wants to observe. Arthur whispered. Roland nodded, and together they followed the rest of the nobles, who could hardly contain their excitement. As with everything else in the keep, the entrance doors were enormous, large enough for a giant to walk through without stooping. Beyond them stretched a hall so vast that Roland had to stop in his tracks. The vaulted ceiling soared high above, supported by ribbed arches and lined with frescoes depicting the Valerian line's triumphs. Crystal chandeliers hung like floating constellations and scattered light across polished marble floors. Enormous tapestries draped the walls, each woven with scenes from old history, mostly depicting battles and famous achievements. Noble men and women paused as soon as they crossed the threshold, struck silent by the sheer grandeur before them. Attendants in immaculate black and silver apparel bowed and signaled for everyone to move deeper inside. The nobles spilled forward and continued their conversations while their personal bodyguards remained at the sides. Roland was also forced to move away from Arthur and join the rest of the knight attendants along the wall. They were not allowed to interact directly with the nobility once inside and could not speak unless given an order. He used the moment to study the knight commanders the other four brothers had arrived with. Theodore's bodyguard stood out due to his sheer size. Although he had changed into more noble attire, the tunic failed to hide his powerful physique. The next noticeable one was the retainer accompanying Julius. While Roland expected a Solarian paladin to appear, he had not imagined it would be a woman with straw-like hair. She wore an immaculate gold military coat marked with the sun motif of the Solarian order. Even without her heavy armor, the weight of her presence was unmistakable. She carried no weapon at her hip, yet Roland could sense divine mana lingering around her body like a silent warning. Julius truly had the church's support, for this person was clearly a powerful paladin trained for battle. The holy mana swirling around her was denser than any of the paladins he had encountered, with the Grand Inquisitor being the only exclusion. If he was not mistaken, she was Lady Bernadette of the Dawn, a well-established member of the church. The church was clearly investing a great deal in this matter, as Bernadette was widely known for defeating many worshippers of evil gods throughout her life. Although she appeared to be in her 20s and was strikingly beautiful, she was in fact over 40 years of age. Her presence alone showed how much effort the church was willing to put into the Duke's son. Roland then turned his attention to another figure, one who looked quite different from the rest. He was neither a noble knight, nor a holy paladin, nor even a muscular warrior, but an old man with a long blue beard. Mana gathered densely around him as well, which meant he was most likely a high-tier mage. That must be Tybalt's retainer, but what's with that giant hat? The man was clearly a powerful mage, most likely already in his second tier 3 class. He wore a robe decorated with star constellations and a large wizard's hat that covered his bald head. That makes 3. The last one would be. Only Ivan's knight commander remained unaccounted for. As Roland searched for him, a presence suddenly appeared behind his back. He sensed a trace of hostility but chose not to react when someone deliberately bumped his shoulder. "Watch where you are going." Roland did not flinch. The man who had run into him was none other than the knight commander of Yvonne Valerian. He stood tall in shining armor that reflected Roland's mask whenever he looked at it. Clearly no one had stripped him of his equipment even though it radiated mana and bore some enchantments. This knight had not been among those who had guarded Yvonne at the tea house. He was far stronger, and Roland could not afford to overlook him. His appearance, however, was strange. Most knights of this caliber looked noble or at least imposing, but this man seemed unpleasant. His face resembled that of a rodent, his nose was crooked, and a bowl cut completed his odd presence. Roland did not respond to the man who looked as though he belonged in a bandit camp rather than in a duke's castle, and this silence seemed to irritate him even more. "Are you ignoring me? Who do you think you are to disregard a high knight commander of House Valerian?" His voice was just as unpleasant as his appearance, but what made it worse was his attitude. Roland found it difficult to understand. The knight was not speaking loudly, yet it was enough to draw attention, and several guards turned to look in their direction. It seemed that Yvonne had either failed to warn this man to be discreet or had deliberately sent him to cause trouble in order to tarnish Arthur's reputation. There were several ways Roland could handle the encounter. One option was to challenge the man to a duel, but he chose something less conspicuous. He simply held his gaze and remained silent. Roland kept his gaze steady, the pale glow of the chandeliers glimmering against his mask. He stood rooted in place, unmoving, neither rising to the provocation nor granting even the courtesy of a reply. His silence was absolute, his posture unyielding, like a wall of iron that refused to shift. The knight commander's lips twisted with displeasure. His gauntleted hand flexed at his side, knuckles creaking against the plates of his armor as though eager to strike. Before he could act, however, the sound of soft footsteps cut through the tension. "Sir Hadrian." The voice was that of a woman, firm despite its softness. At once, the knight commander stiffened. His posture changed as if he were a child caught misbehaving, and he quickly turned toward the figure who had spoken. Roland also shifted his gaze and saw an older woman with striking red hair. Her features bore a resemblance to someone he knew. Could this be? I pay respect to Lady Scarlet." Hadrian bent his head quickly, all his hostility was instantly buried beneath a display of obedience. His tone wavered, but his eyes darted in Roland's direction, still simmering with malice. Roland studied the woman more closely. The resemblance to Yvonne was undeniable, her sharp cheekbones, the proud set of her jaw, and the fiery hair streaked with threads of silver. This was Ivan's mother, the Lady Scarlet Valerian. Her presence carried weight, not only because of her noble lineage but also because she radiated authority. The nobles nearby, who had been half pretending not to watch the exchange, suddenly bowed their heads or averted their gazes. To make matters worse, she was not alone. 3 other women approached, each distinguished by her own hairstyle and color. Roland had no idea what he had done to deserve this, yet here he was facing all the noble mothers of the heirs. With all of them gathered, he could do nothing but bow and stare at the ground. They were the wives of the Duke, and none seemed to like one another very much. Lady Scarlet, you have poor taste in servants if they lack manners. The woman at her right spoke first. Her words were smooth but mocking. She wore a gown of midnight blue threaded with tiny gems that sparkled like stars. Her azure hair was braided into something resembling a crown, and her smile was polite yet venomous. Roland guessed her to be Lady Celeste, Tybalt's mother. A ripple of muffled chuckles spread through the area as the other 2 women joined together to mock one of their rivals. Roland could not begin to understand how he had ended up in such a situation, but one thing was certain. It was safer not to move, for a single word from any of these ladies could end his whole existence in an instant. Wait, aren't those 4? Yes, they are. Please be quiet, or you will get us in trouble. The nobles turned their faces toward a strange scene unfolding. 4 women were speaking together, each well known and prominent within her own circle. Behind them stood small groups of lesser nobles, mostly women, with a few silent servants among them. Lady Scarlet, the one with crimson hair, did not look pleased, yet soon her lips curled into a sharp smile. Better poor taste than no taste at all, Lady Celeste. You look like a peacock draped in sapphires. Celeste's eyes narrowed, and the gems in her hair glittered as she mockingly tilted her head. And yet, Lady Scarlet, peacocks are still admired. Some of us need not breathe fire like common tavern drunks to be noticed. A third voice broke in before Scarlet could reply. It was a refined voice, one laced with a feeling of superiority. Bantering like fishermen's wives already, I see. How predictable. The speaker was a tall, slim woman with raven hair, dressed in a gown of dark silk that seemed to be woven from shadows themselves. Jewels glittered at her throat, a deliberate display of wealth and rank. She carried herself like one accustomed to command, her chin lifted as though she looked down upon all others. Lady Layla, how nice of you to join us. Your dress looks as gaudy as ever, said Lady Scarlet, her frown plain for all to see. Lady Layla arched a brow at this response, and her dark eyes gleamed with disdain. Gaudy? My dear Scarlet, this fabric was woven in the capital by the royal tailors themselves. Not that you would know the difference. Flame burns bright, yes, but it lacks refinement. A pity your son inherited the same vulgar temperament. Gasps and muffled laughter rippled through the circle of noble women who had gathered like vultures to a fresh carcass. It was rare enough for the Duke's 4 wives to appear together, rarer still for them to trade insults so openly. Scarlet's face flushed red with fury, and she was about to unleash a retort when another voice intervened. It was another noble woman, her words smooth and calming. Ladies, please, let us remain civil. Lady Aurelia stepped forward. Her golden hair shimmered in the chandelier light, and her gown, woven of gold with silver trim, seemed to glow as it caught the rays. The sun motif embroidered across her bodice marked her devotion to Solaria. Every gesture she made carried the grace of a true lady, the kind poets would immortalize in song. My dear sisters, we stand in the Duke's hall. Let us show the dignity befitting our station. Let us remember the eyes upon us, and the honor, the burden, our children must one day carry forward. Her words drifted through the hall like a calming breeze amid a storm. Where Scarlet's voice crackled like fire and Layla's dripped with venom, Aurelia's floated with poise and restraint. She did not appear to mock or accuse, yet her words were not received kindly by the others. Dignity befitting our station? Are you suggesting we are acting unladylike? What audacity! Layla's eyes narrowed, her tone sharp, and neither Scarlet nor Celeste seemed pleased either. The air grew rigid, the atmosphere heavy, while nobles leaned closer to catch every word. For many of them, such gatherings were the only true diversion from their estates. What seemed like polite conversation was, in truth, warfare. At such gatherings, alliances were forged and broken in moments, friends discarded as quickly as rivals were courted. It reminded Roland of the days he had spent among nobles, though his own time had been brief. In the 5 years he lived as a noble's child, he had witnessed such spectacles often. His stepmothers had hosted similar gatherings, and he remembered well how laughter could shift to slander the instant backs were turned. Once you are the wife of a duke, unless royalty is present, there seems to be no reason to hold back. From where he stood, he could see the 4 ladies exchanging insults. He wasn't sure if Julius's mother was doing it on purpose, but some of her words came off as rude, though they could also be masked as goodwill. Whether intentional or not, the disruption they created proved useful to him. It gave him the chance to slip away from the knight eager to provoke a fight. He glanced aside toward Arthur, who lingered at the edge of the hall. Arthur's expression was distant, his gaze fixed on the 4 women, though his eyes seemed to search for someone beyond them. His stare roamed across the chandeliers, the jeweled gowns, and the silken cloaks of the assembled nobility, yet it always returned to the shadowed doorways. Roland had a fair idea of whom Arthur longed to see. Yet such a wish could never be granted, not here, not in this hall, not within the rigid confines of noble society. Arthur's mother was no human but a moon elf, and though her beauty and grace were beyond question, she had no noble birth within the kingdom. To the lords and ladies gathered here, such a truth was intolerable. It was a stain that made Arthur's chosen path all the more difficult. "What do you mean by that?" An annoyed voice echoed through the hall again. "Oh? Did I strike a chord?" The bickering among the duke's wives resumed, but before it could escalate further, a voice thundered from the far end of the hall. Roland recognized it at once. "Ladies and gentlemen!" It was the butler. His voice carried through the chamber, boosted by the power of magic that silenced even the most stubborn whispers. A small group of attendants stood behind him, maids and butlers dressed in impeccable attire. "His Grace welcomes you to his palace." At once, the hall fell into silence. Every gaze turned upward, searching. The eyes of the nobility shifted instinctively to the second level, where private booths overlooked the grand ballroom. The vast chamber was divided into 2 tiers, the main floor with its polished dance floor and banquet tables, and the upper level, where the great and powerful observed from the seclusion of their own chambers. Each of the duke's wives possessed a private booth, furnished and reserved for their allies and confidants. At the very center, dominating the highest wall, stood the duke's own throne-like chair, the seat of the master of the palace. Yet, it remained empty. Where is he? Roland wondered at the duke's absence as he glanced about the hall. Though the man had considerable freedom in how he conducted himself, this was a moment when tradition demanded his presence. He should have been here to greet the assembled nobility. The confusion in the crowd was plain, and even his 4 wives seemed uncertain of the reason he had not appeared. "His Grace will join us later. He has been detained with urgent matters of state." The butler's voice carried with its usual polish, steady and composed, yet Roland noticed the shifting of shoulders, the narrowing of eyes. The nobles were not convinced. The explanation rang hollow, too neat, like a line rehearsed to keep unrest at bay. Whispers started almost instantly, and with his enhanced hearing, Roland could hear it all. Too busy to greet his own court. Perhaps he grows weary of his wife's endless quarrels. Or is this a statement? Does he resent someone's presence, perhaps the Solarian paladins? Speculation spread like fire through dry grass. Some remarks carried little weight, while others made quite a lot of sense. Roland knew the truth beneath it all. Even if Julius was favored in the Battle of Heirs, there were many who despised the changes he championed. To them, the Solarian Church was not a blessing but an intrusion, an outsider's hand creeping into their duchy, bound not to this kingdom but to the power of the West. The Holy Kingdom of Alexandria had expanded its influence deep into the realm, and not everyone welcomed it. Paladins now swarmed the land, empowered by the king to investigate even the nobility. Many resented this intrusion but could not openly oppose it, since the church remained essential in the fight against evil beings and forbidden magic. Without a paladin or cleric strengthened by divine power, resisting dark sorcery was nearly impossible. This was one of the main reasons he kept his progress secret. He had discovered a way to emulate divinity itself. It could serve as a bargaining chip to protect his life, yet it would also paint a target on his back. If his invention were revealed, the prestige of the Solarian Church would surely diminish. If runic equipment could rival the power of priests and paladins, there would be little reason to keep funding them. He could see the immense earning potential in his work. Nobles would likely pay handsomely for divine cannons or holy grenades that could strengthen their forces against the undead. Yet the venture was filled with danger. He had no way of knowing how far the zealotry of the faithful extended. It was entirely possible that he would be branded a heretic, an enemy not only of the Solarian Church but of every religion. Since he could also replicate necrotic mana and even the essence of black magic, that alone might be enough to condemn him as a necromancer or warlock who deserved execution. Please enjoy the gathering, ladies and gentlemen. We have prepared a feast worthy of your status. With a graceful sweep of his hand, the butler bowed, and the attendants withdrew, leaving the nobles to murmur and shift like restless birds. The long banquet tables glittered with crystal goblets and silver platters, though no servant dared lift a lid until the guests themselves made the first move. The chamber soon filled with the rustle of silk and the steady tap of boots as the nobles finally began to take their seats. Roland did not join them. He remained by the wall, his mask concealing his expression as he quietly observed the gathering. Though his helmet was absent, the mask still retained most of its functions. This was an ideal chance to expand his database with the mana signatures of nobles, their trusted soldiers, and their closest advisors. Arthur, meanwhile, took a tall glass of wine and settled at an empty table, well apart from the other nobility. This was the time for mingling and striking bargains, yet no one seemed interested in approaching the young heir candidate. The other 4 heirs were present as well, but they did not so much as glance his way. Instead, they clustered around their mothers, surrounded by eager lesser nobles vying for favor. Still, whispers followed Arthur wherever he lingered. That must be the half-blood. Yes. His features are handsome enough, I suppose, though it is still elf blood. Some say he has talent. The Duke's son is still the Duke's son. Humph. Let him climb if he dares. No house will marry their daughters to him. No one wants elf ears on their grandchildren. I heard they vanish by the 3rd generation, so perhaps it would be fine. His exploits are impressive. Yes. Best to wait until the assembly is finished. Indeed. Roland caught the words clearly. Some nobles dwelled on Arthur's half-elven heritage, others on his growing reputation after capturing a city and extending his influence so late in the heir race. Yet none of them were prepared to offer support. Not until the assembly ended, and they could gauge the Duke's opinion of his 5th son. Time passed, yet Arthur remained seated alone, the stem of his glass slowly turning between his fingers. His expression stayed composed, though Roland could tell he was listening. Every sneer, every whisper, every word was a dagger meant to remind him of his place. Still, Arthur gave no response. He neither rose to defend himself nor acknowledged the nobles circling like hawks. He simply endured. What is he trying to achieve? Hours slipped by with little of note, and Roland began to think the day might end in nothing more than tedious posturing. But once the nobles had settled in and drink loosened their tongues, some began to reveal their true colors. One of them was Arthur's brother, infamous for his short temper and fondness for wine. Brother? Brother? You think you've earned the right to call me that, bastard? Yvonne Valerian had finally decided to confront Arthur. Roland could not entirely understand the reasoning. There was little to be gained from antagonizing someone so low on the ladder. The most he could assume was that Yvonne, desperate to reclaim lost prestige, saw Arthur as an easy target, a convenient punching bag to relieve his anger. Ivan's voice carried through the banquet hall like a whip crack. Though half the nobles were already drunk and feigning disinterest, many focused their ears on the encounter. Arthur seemed to be as calm as stone. He raised his glass and took another sip before lowering it carefully and speaking up. Isn't my presence here enough proof for that, brother? Arthur made sure to say the last word slowly and deliberately, his voice laced with mockery. He gave Yvonne no chance to recover before pressing on. Perhaps it is you who should worry about your standing more than me? It was truly a terrible thing, what happened to the city of Rika, if only their lord had not been so incompetent. Arthur's words cut like a dagger. He did not raise his voice, yet the calmness with which he spoke made things even worse. Whispers rippled through the hall, turning into stifled laughter and muted gasps. Nobles who had moments earlier feigned indifference now leaned forward, their eyes bright with intrigue. Still, perhaps I ought to thank you instead? Because of that disaster, I managed to secure my own lands against the cultists. In truth, I could not have done it without you. You have been one of my greatest benefactors, brother. Ivan's face flushed crimson, his hand tightening around his crystal goblet until the crystal cracked with a sharp snap. Wine spilled across his hand, red as blood, but he seemed not to notice or just didn't care. His lips pulled back in a twisted grin, the kind that indicated mockery. "You dare speak to me like that? You, a half-breed mistake!" His voice echoed through the grand hall, silencing even the most drunken chatter. Arthur, however, remained perfectly still. His expression betrayed nothing, though the faintest curve tugged at his lips, and Yvonne didn't take kindly to that. His hand shot forward, aiming at Arthur's nape. Ivan's hand cut through the air, his fingers clawed and trembling with rage. The motion was swift, fueled by his drunken fury and his Tier 3 might. But before it could find its target, Arthur's hand rose to meet it. A sharp crack echoed across the banquet hall as Arthur smacked Ivan's arm away, sending the older brother stumbling a half-step backward. Gasps rippled through the hall. Nobles who had been pretending not to watch now leaned forward, their eyes wide, their fans fluttering as whispers darted from lip to lip. Was that aura? That or magic? The red haze around Arthur's hand, which struck Ivan's aside, was clearly visible and done with intent. Yvonne froze, his chest rising and falling as if he could not grasp what had just happened. He had always been taller, broader, and by reputation far stronger. He too had mastered the aura, yet his hand now tingled from the blow. You. His voice broke off, his face twisting in disbelief. For the first time in years, doubt showed in his eyes, but it was quickly consumed by rage. His fist began to glow, crimson aura gathering at his knuckles. Just as he was about to unleash it, a man appeared in front of him, barring the way to Arthur. "You dare!" The man said nothing. He stood firm, blocking the path to Arthur in silence. His mask concealed his features, though several nobles recognized him as Wayland, the knight commander who had accompanied Arthur earlier. "It is fine, Sir Wayland. My brother has simply had too much to drink." Arthur smiled as he rose, placing himself beside Roland, who gave a small nod and stepped back. Soon, Ivan's knight moved forward. He was the same man who had tried to provoke Roland earlier. Sir Hadrian's eyes burned with hostility as he took his place beside his master, his armored hand drifted towards the hilt of his sword, ready to be drawn if his master ordered him to. The clash between the brothers continued while everyone watched from the sides. The noble ladies hid their faces behind gem-encrusted fans, and the gentlemen smiled without bothering to conceal their interest. This was one of the moments they loved the most, when rivals fought and turned it into a spectacle. None of them truly cared which brother would be victorious, yet for some reason it seemed that Arthur was gaining the upper hand, at least for the moment. "Bastard! If you will not kneel before your betters, then perhaps a wager is in order," Yvonne said as he glanced at Roland, who was standing to the side. "A wager?" Arthur replied, already beginning to understand where this was leading. He turned his eyes toward the man standing beside Yvonne. Sir Hadrian was a well-known knight, infamous for his temper. From Roland's perspective he suited the third brother well, since that one preferred to solve every problem with brute force. "Hadrian, if I am not mistaken. He is an Aura knight." Before coming here, Roland had gathered information on all the knight commanders and mercenaries of note who might appear. Among them were Lady Bernadette, who accompanied Julius, and the powerful mage who served as Tybalt's retainer. In terms of strength, Hadrian was formidable and likely a more dangerous opponent for Roland than the old mage. Yet he still ranked behind the paladin and Theodore's bodyguard, who was probably the strongest of them all. That assessment, however, had been made when Roland possessed the entirety of his half-plate armor. The guards had confiscated his cape and gauntlets, leaving his suit incomplete. He considered the hidden spatial compartment in his boot, which still held one of his remaining elemental suits, but retrieving it was not an option. Even so, there were still ways to acquire equipment when it came to a duel. Arthur tilted his glass just slightly, as though weighing the wager in his mind. The nobles leaned closer, hushed voices rippling through the hall. The challenge was already understood by all who stood witness. A duel. Not between the brothers themselves, but between the steel that served them. "If that is the game you wish to play," Arthur said at last, his voice calm and measured, "then I will oblige. But we must ensure it is fair. Would you not agree, brother?" "Fair? What fairness is owed to a mistake like you?" He threw his hand outward, gesturing toward Sir Hadrian. It was clear that he understood what Arthur was referring to. At a glance, Hadrian's gear was far superior, forged from pristine metal and marked with enchantments that were supposedly forbidden within the castle. "My knight has no need for excuses. He will carve your dog to pieces, armor or no armor." A sneer twisted Hadrian's rodent-like face as he stepped forward, his enchanted armor gleaming unnaturally bright beneath the chandeliers. The polished mithril was edged with runes of the highest quality, each one waiting to be activated. The bowl-cut hair framing his crooked nose made him look almost ridiculous, yet his infamy silenced any laughter. No one dared to mock him, for he was a force to be reckoned with. Roland did not move. He stood in silence, allowing the crowd to compare Hadrian's gleaming figure with his own plain attire. His cape, gauntlets, and several armaments had been taken from him by the guards before the ball, leaving him a shadow of what he might have been in his full suit of armor. Arthur knew this, which was why he raised his voice just enough for all to hear. Since our host's guards have been so diligent in their duties, I must ask for some time to see my knight properly equipped. Surely even you, brother, do not wish this matter to descend into a farce. A ripple of agreement moved through the nobles. Even those who cared little for Arthur's position knew that a duel stripped of fairness would bring shame upon the one who demanded it. Ivan's grin faltered for a moment before he mustered up a laugh. Fine. Dress him up however you like. It will not change the outcome. Arthur inclined his head slightly, his smile sharp in a way that Ivan seemed to despise. Then we agree. The duel shall be held outside beneath the open sky in, how about 2 hours? It is only fitting that all present bear witness. 2 hours? Make it 1. Ivan answered quickly, a frown on his face. He then gestured toward a servant who hurried forward and bowed. Give this man something to wear. Yes, my lord. Roland observed the exchange and instantly knew that something was wrong, but he held his tongue. They were in enemy territory and had no choice but to follow the rules. The fact that he had gained even a single hour to prepare was already more than he had expected. The servant bowed low and gestured for Roland to follow. Arthur's gaze lingered on him for only a moment, but Roland caught the subtle flicker in his eyes, a wordless reminder to be cautious. He followed the servant out of the grand hall, past marble pillars and tapestries, until the sounds of music and gossip faded into silence. The path twisted through narrow corridors seldom used by nobles. Dust clung to the air, cobwebs stretched across corners, and the lanterns here burned weaker. At last they stopped before a pair of wooden doors. The servant pushed them open with a creak and inside lay the so-called equipment chamber. Even this place has parts like this. Roland was a little surprised. He had expected the innermost castle to be well maintained in every regard, yet even this place had its forgotten corners. The dust-filled chamber resembled an old storage room more than an armory suited for a knight. It was obvious to him that the servant was working under Ivan. If Roland went back to complain about this treatment, he might receive better equipment, but it was far more likely that it would only serve as an excuse to mock Arthur. Is there an issue, Sir Knight? No, everything is fine. Return in an hour to guide me to the dueling grounds. Of course, sir. Take your time. The man seemed somewhat surprised by Roland's answer but quickly bowed and retreated down the corridor. His footsteps echoed long after he was gone. Roland waited until he was sure no one was watching before moving deeper into the chamber. The smell of dust and rust hung heavy in the room. Old helmets and dented breastplates lay in heaps along the wall, their surfaces corroded with age. Spears with cracked shafts leaned at awkward angles in one corner, their tips bent and dulled from long neglect. A rack of swords stood nearby, but most of the blades were chipped, their edges blunt and jagged. This was no arsenal for a knight but instead a graveyard of forgotten weapons. Quite the treasure trove. Roland muttered with a sigh, prodding one of the armor racks. A cloud of dust burst into the air, stinging his nose. Nothing here was usable, of that he was certain. True metals of higher quality gave off mana or other energies, and he had already swept the entire chamber with several of his skills. None of the equipment reached Tier 3 standards. A few of these looked promising, but they would shatter after one proper exchange. He examined a sword coated with a thin layer of mithril, but the deception was plain to him. His background as a blacksmith made it easy to see that it was only a cheap replica. The faint outer layer concealed the simple iron within. An inexperienced knight might take it at face value and wield it. Was that what they were aiming for? The items here were in terrible condition and completely unusable. A better strategy would have been to leave or perhaps ask one of the regular guards for a suit of armor to borrow instead. However, Roland was not an ordinary knight commander. He had come prepared. They will probably be quite surprised when I return. I just need to make it look believable. Roland had no intention of leaving this room within the hour. It was impossible to make use of the rusted steel lying around, so he would instead downgrade some of the equipment he had brought with him. From his pocket he pulled out something that resembled a handkerchief. In the upper right corner was a small metallic plate shaped like a hexagon, engraved with the symbol of the kingdom. He injected a bit of mana into it and the concealed rune activated, revealing the hidden spatial spell within. They left a few guards behind, but none of them seem well versed in magic. After clearing some space on a dust-covered table, Roland began setting out his tools. His spatial inventory contained his runic smithing hammer along with several other useful items. Among them was a vial filled with a brownish liquid, something essential for the deception he was about to perform. I just need to make it look convincing. On one side of the table he laid out the armor parts he had brought with him. There were gauntlets, greaves, and other pieces that would complete his appearance and bring him closer to the look of full plate armor. At that moment, only his breastplate, pauldrons, and boots remained in use. The rest needed to be added if he hoped to stand a chance in the duel against the overbearing Aura Knight. These replacement parts were not taken from his elemental suits. They were ordinary sets of armor he had kept hidden away for an occasion like this. Each one carried dummy runes that could later be reshaped. Though they were weaker than his usual armor, they were still far superior to anything these people could provide. He only needed to add a few details to make them convincing. He began with one of the replacement gauntlets, carefully choosing one that resembled the rusty pieces scattered throughout the room. From his side he drew a vial of liquid and poured it over the polished surface. The metal reacted at once, its shine fading as it dulled into the same rusted, dust-covered look that clung to many of the other suits of armor nearby. "This will do. Sir, the time has come." A knock echoed through the corridor outside. Nearly an hour had passed since the man called Wayland had entered the dust-filled chamber. The servant stood waiting with a smile, certain that this was a joyous occasion. He had lured the target here exactly as he had been ordered. The fool! His pride kept him from refusing. "That makes my work easier." The servant believed the knight was nothing more than a stubborn fool unwilling to complain. For an hour he had remained inside a room filled with broken and discarded equipment that was soon to be destroyed. "Is he coming out?" After knocking a second time, impatience began to gnaw at him. Suddenly the door swung open and his jaw nearly dropped. "What is this? Has he lost his mind? He means to fight a duel looking like that?" The sight of the man who should have been a noble knight commander left him stunned. He wanted to speak but held his tongue. "The time has come, sir." The man paused briefly before stepping forward. "Lead me there." The servant swallowed and forced his feet to move. Each step rang through the corridor as he guided the knight, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "He looks as if he dug through a midden heap and strapped on whatever he found. This will be over quickly. The Lord will be pleased." At last they emerged from the dim corridors into the open light of the arena. Noblemen and ladies had already taken their seats on raised benches. The justing ground had been converted into a dueling ring, and the air was filled with the chatter and laughter of the highborn. Jeweled hands clutched gilded goblets, silks shimmered in the breeze, and every face twisted with amusement as their eyes settled on the knight at the servant's side. "Rust suits him well, don't you think? A knight commander? He looks more like a stable hand dressed in scraps." Mayhaps the bastard truly found his reflection in this dog. The servant moved towards the side but could not help himself from chuckling as well. The knight that was supposed to represent Arthur Valerian, the fifth brother, looked ridiculous. The laughter spread like wildfire. Even the stiffest of nobles could not resist covering their lips. For them, this was entertainment, a rare chance to sneer at both the bastard son and his so-called knight. Wayland walked with slow steps, his shield slung over his back and the warpick at his side. The armor he wore rattled faintly with every movement, its surface a strange patchwork of dulled steel, flaking bronze, and pieces that all seemed to mismatch with each other. Together they formed a discolored set of armor that was finished by a strange face mask instead of a proper helmet. Yet though the nobles laughed, his stride did not falter. Across the ring, Sir Hadrian was already waiting. His armor was sleek, clearly designed to enhance his control of aura. Intricate runes covered the metal, some already glowing red as he gathered energy to display his strength. He stood tall and proud, his chin tilted at an arrogant angle, and when his small, beady eyes fell on Roland, his sneer stretched into a grin. "Well, well. The mutt found himself a suit. Did you raid the castle's compost heap for that?" His voice was loud and nasal, carrying easily across the arena and drawing fresh laughter from the crowd. Roland gave no reply. His lips did not move, but his fingers adjusted on the haft of the warpick, testing its weight with quiet confidence. His silence only seemed to encourage Hadrian further. "Ha, look at you. Hadrian sniggered at the sight before him. I am an honorable man. Kneel and apologize to me and my lord, and I will show you mercy. The small crowd of nobles laughed, with the ones sitting around Ivan being the loudest. Sir Hadrian is so gracious and mindful. Indeed he is. Ivan seemed content with their words, though his attention was already drifting elsewhere. His wife had appeared and sat beside him, and as if spellbound by her beauty, his anger faded. The competition no longer seemed to matter, as though the outcome had already been decided. Arthur sat far from his brother, isolated and unsupported. Not a single person dared approach his side, though many watched with keen interest to see what might unfold. Yet after seeing the disheveled state of his knight, they could only frown, as if realizing that their hopes of winning favor with this noble had been nothing more than foolish vanity. Nothing to say. Hadrian barked the words and puffed out his chest, as though silence itself were an insult. Then I will break that mask and drag an apology out of you. Another figure stepped forward, dressed like a butler. It was the judge of the competition. By the will of House Valerian, and before the eyes of his grace and the assembled nobility, this duel is hereby sanctified. Though the duke himself was absent, the declaration carried across the dueling arena and silenced the whispers. Both knights stepped forward with their weapons drawn. Hadrian wielded an unusual weapon, not a sword but a long mace with spikes covering the head. Aura already shimmered across its surface as he waited for the judge to give the order to commence. Roland tilted his head slightly, his face hidden by the mask. His warpick swung loosely at his side, held as casually as a farmer might carry a tool. To the crowd it seemed like mockery, as though he did not even know how to hold a knight's weapon. Laughter rippled through the benches, but Arthur did not laugh. His hands remained folded, his eyes fixed on Wayland, and his face revealed nothing. Combatants, take your stance. Hadrian lifted the mace, aura swirling around it like a heat haze. His boots sank into the sand as he braced for the charge. Wayland lowered his stance and exhaled once, the warpick resting at an odd and seemingly unthreatening angle. Begin! Hadrian roared and surged forward, the ground trembling beneath his armored stride. His aura burst outward in red fire as he raised the weapon high, ready to smash Wayland's face before he could even move. The crowd leaned forward, eager for the crunch of steel, but what followed was entirely different. At the last instant the knight's form blurred, and the sound that rang out was not of a mace striking home but of a warpick colliding with shiny mithril instead. The sound was like a hammer striking an anvil, sharp, clear, and far louder than anyone expected. Sparks burst in a violent spray as Hadrian's strike was knocked off course. His mace twisted away, the head gouging a shallow groove into the packed sand instead of Roland's chest. For an instant, the crowd went silent. Their laughter died in their throats as the rusted knight, who had looked so pitiful only moments before, stood tall like an unmoving titan. What? Boom! Hadrian's small eyes bulged as something slammed into his chest. He was sent flying backward as if struck by an ogre. His arms flailed, the spiked mace nearly slipping from his grasp, but he clung to it even as his body spun and crashed into the sand. He tumbled across the arena before slamming against the stone wall with a thunderous crack. Dust rained down, and the nobles gasped in unison. A barrier of magic flickered to life around the justing arena, shielding the nobles from the dirt cloud kicked up by Hadrian's impact. The Aura Knight groaned, half buried in the dirt at the very edge of the dueling ring. His gleaming mithril armor was no longer immaculate, dulled by dust clinging to every joint and crease. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, coughing, his face twisted in disbelief. The nobles had expected Roland to be crushed within moments. Instead, it was Hadrian who now looked like a man thrown from his horse. To make matters worse, a large dirty footprint stained his chest, the mark of the kick that had sent him flying. While humiliating on its own, the true disgrace followed moments later. As Hadrian staggered up, his headgear, or rather, the carefully trimmed bowl of hair that crowned it, shifted. Confusion rippled through the crowd as the wig slid sideways, then toppled into the dirt. Silence held for a heartbeat before the arena erupted in laughter. The nobles could not contain themselves at the sight of the mighty Aura Knight losing his hair. Hadrian stood frozen, his bald head gleaming in the sunlight, dust clinging to the sweat on his scalp. His face flushed crimson, veins bulged at his temples, and his teeth clenched. The laughter only deepened his fury. "Why, you bastard!" He roared and spun about, shouting as his furious glare fell on his squire waiting just outside the arena. "My helmet! Now!" The poor boy scrambled, nearly tripping over himself as he rushed forward with the missing piece of Hadrian's equipment. Meanwhile, the nobles were beside themselves, many of the ladies fanning their faces frantically as they tried and failed to stifle their laughter. Gentlemen leaned back with broad smiles, delighted by this unexpected comedy. However, amid the laughter, a group of people remained silent as they watched the man sitting in the middle, Ivan Valerian. His face burned with embarrassment and his knuckles turned white as he crushed the crystal glass of wine in his hand. The red liquid dribbled across his fingers, but he either did not care or failed to notice in his rage. Every snicker and every muffled chuckle from the gallery cut into his pride like a blade. Arthur's lips curved upward ever so slightly. He tilted his glass with lazy indifference as though the laughter meant nothing to him, yet his eyes gleamed with delight. He glanced at his brother, who was fuming, then turned toward Roland, who stood motionless in the center of the ring, appearing not to care at all. Is he doing that on purpose? Arthur muttered to himself while watching Hadrian snatch the helmet from his squire. He rammed it onto his head with a metallic clang. His anger was palpable, and his aura flared violently around him. Crimson light seeped through the armor, and the magical symbols etched into it magnified the glow. The sand beneath his feet darkened and turned black as a wave of energy rippled across the dueling ground. The laughter of the nobles faltered as they realized the fight was about to continue. Enough! He roared, his voice raw with fury. No more tricks! No more mockery! I will crush you! Roland did not move. His mismatched armor looked duller than ever beneath the shimmering heat, yet the war pick in his grip remained steady. His masked gaze fixed on Hadrian, and he lifted his shoulders in a mocking shrug. Without speaking a word, he raised his shield and waited for the attack, daring his opponent to strike. The duel resumes. The judge, shaken by what had just occurred, urged the men to continue. Hadrian charged, faster this time, his body blurring beneath the aurum mantle he was now covered in. His mace howled through the air as it descended on his enemy. The crowd gasped when sparks erupted from the collision. The ground beneath the two knights cracked, and a shockwave blasted outward in every direction. The mace slammed into Roland's shield with a deafening crash, activating the protective barrier around the arena. Some of the nobles fell from their seats as the ground rumbled beneath their feet. The force reverberated through the arena, yet Roland did not fall. His stance, though strained, held steady against the crushing power. Hadrian snarled, wrenching his mace free and swinging again. He struck faster and harder, each blow raining down like a smith's hammer. Yet the so-called rusted knight never buckled. His shield intercepted most of the strikes, and many others missed entirely. With quick steps he began retreating, moving backward while the knight covered in aura chased him and shouted. Stand still, damn you! Hadrian's fury grew as he failed to land a proper blow. Even though his opponent's shield looked like a pile of rust, it refused to break. Instead, the spikes on his mace bent and lost their sharpness. The crowd saw a knight fighting defensively, and at first they cheered, but soon they began to realize that something was wrong. Is this how these fights usually go? Lord Ivan's knight is winning, right? I am not sure. He is an aura knight. The other one should already be crushed. Is he playing with him? Roland's armor rattled with every sidestep. His mismatched plates clanked awkwardly, but his movements never faltered. Within his gaze, the enemy's attacks unfolded as mana phantoms. Although Hadrian kept increasing his speed and power through aura, Roland's skill allowed him to predict every strike. The force behind each blow was real and would cause serious damage if one landed cleanly, yet none of them did. This armor will not last much longer. I should finish this soon. The armor was not truly rusted, but it was inferior compared to his usual runic equipment. He had focused on enhancing himself with stat-boosting magic and simple rune spells. That was enough to contend with this opponent, but if the fight dragged on, he would be in danger. His adversary was still a powerful aurum master who did not rely entirely on his weapons. As the fight continued, no runes appeared on his body thanks to the rune concealment skill. If this had been his past self, his entire armor would have been glowing like a beacon. He was constantly using runic magic, yet with the skill active none of it showed. The drawback was a constant strain on his mana. The drain had begun at 10% and steadily increased each time he used a rune. It has reached 20% now. Eventually, it will overwhelm me. It was time to raise the intensity. He had remained on the defensive long enough. One reason was to test how well he could conceal his runes, and the other was to exhaust his opponent. Aura functioned differently from mana. It strengthened physical fighters, enhancing them beyond human limits, but it carried risks. It was tied directly to their health and stamina. Prolonged use took a heavy toll, and his opponent was already beginning to slow down. Hadrian's face twisted crimson beneath the helm. His breath grew ragged, his aura flared wildly, and the crimson haze seared the sand black with every step. Yet no matter how much strength he poured into each strike, he could not break through. "Stop running." "As you wish." Roland finally spoke back to the man who had swung wildly at him. His opponent had lost any sense of strategy. At first, his strikes carried intent, measured with feints and precision. Now everything had fallen apart, collapsing into a frenzied storm of random blows that only served to exhaust him. This was one of the greatest weaknesses in this world. Strength came from levels and the steady rise of skills. Battles were usually decided by a few key factors. The first was the sheer difference in levels, the second was the type of class, and the third was the range of skills a fighter possessed. Few people ever trained to face opponents of equal standing because such encounters were rare and difficult to prepare for. The gap created by levels and experience was rarely something that could be overcome with strategies. Rather than focusing on combat tactics, most simply devoted themselves to pushing their abilities higher, as though no limit truly existed. This over-reliance on skills left many unable to contend with those who matched them in raw stats. Roland was below this man's level and only managed to endure through the aid of his armor and magic. If Hadrian had remained calm and recognized the opponent before him, victory might have been within reach. Instead, drained of stamina, his aura attacks were faltering, his speed was slowing, and his reactions were already diminishing. Roland's shield caught another blow, the clang ringing through the air. Dust rose, veiling the fighters and making it difficult for the nobles to follow the exchange. Hadrian staggered back, chest heaving, his aura flickering like a torch on the verge of burning out. He tried to wrench his mangled mace free from the shield, but it would not budge. A strange bluish force held it fast, crackling like lightning. This was Roland's moment. He had cast a spell that magnetized the knight's mace to his shield. With a sharp pull, he dragged the weapon downward, forcing Hadrian to open his flank. From the start, Roland had noticed that this man would never let go of his weapon. To certain knights, abandoning a weapon was as disgraceful as losing an honorable duel. Today, that stubborn pride would cost Hadrian dearly. Roland had many ways to finish the fight. He could call upon the skill overlord's might and unleash his full strength, turning the man into nothing more than a punching bag while cloaked in violet light. Yet he did not wish to reveal all his cards. The spectators still believed him to be nothing more than a rune mage. To confuse them, he would do something no mage could ever achieve, he would wield aura. Roland's hand tightened on the haft of the warpick. Mana surged through the runes hidden beneath his armor, weaving along secret circuits. Ordinarily, the power would have glowed and betrayed him, but his concealment skill kept the flow hidden. To the nobles watching from the stands, what came next would look like something entirely different. Crimson arcs of energy crawled across the mismatched plates of Roland's armor, flaring outward like waves of heat. The air around him warped and crackled as grains of sand rose from the ground, swirling in a spiral at his feet. To their eyes, this was aura and not energy emulation through runes. Hadrian froze, his bloodshot eyes narrowing behind the slit of his helm. He lifted his shield to guard his side, but the warpick shot forward with extreme speed. Its spike shone with aura as it crashed against the knight's shield. For a heartbeat, it seemed the block had held. Then came the grinding screech of tearing mithril as the warpick punched through the metal and drove on. The spike burst through Hadrian's shield with a shriek that split the arena. The nobles gasped, some rising to their feet, their jeweled cups forgotten or dropped and shattered. The warpick did not stop at the shield as it drove onward and slammed into Hadrian's breastplate. Crack! The sound was wet, a mix of groaning metal and breaking ribs. A crimson shockwave rippled through the arena, visible to all, as if the very air had ignited from the clash of energies. Sand and dust erupted in every direction, whipping across the dueling ring in a violent storm. An armored body flew like a rag doll, spinning through the air until it smashed against the arena's barrier. The mana shield glowed bright blue under the impact, spiderweb cracks racing across its surface. Mages on the side began chanting, weaving spells to mend the tear and safeguard the nobles seated beyond. The crowd recoiled. Nobles in the front rows shielded their faces, some shrieking as the barrier groaned but held, keeping Hadrian's broken body from bursting through into their midst. The Aura Knight slid down the shimmering wall, leaving a red smear of blood in his wake. He collapsed in a heap not far from where Yvonne sat, coughing with teeth shattered and blood spilling from his mouth. A silence heavier than death swallowed the arena. Roland looked to his right arm, the one that had wielded the warpick. His weapon still pulsed with energy, though it was mangled into an unrecognizable mess. The armor on that side had been torn clean away after a single activation of the emulated aura. The technique remained volatile and difficult to control, and his mana had been almost completely drained by just one strike. Yet the result was what mattered. In the distance, he saw both his enemy and his master. Ivan Valerian's face was twisted with fury, the veins in his temple swelling as if they might burst. His wife touched his arm gently in an attempt to calm him, but he pushed her hand away. Blood dribbled from his lip where he had bitten it in indignation. Get up, you useless fool! Ivan shouted loudly, but Hadrian did not respond. Instead, he slumped forward with his life hanging in the balance. This angered the Valerian brother, and soon he glared at Roland, who stood in the middle of the ring. Impossible! Guards, apprehend that man! He must have cheated. The other nobles murmured among themselves, displeased by Ivan's outburst. It was clear that this young master was unaccustomed to losing wagers, yet his behavior only worsened his standing. He lacked the prominence to make such accusations, and the guards ignored his command, turning instead toward the other members of the Valerian family. The three brothers and their mothers remained silent. Even his own mother simply lifted her fan to hide her face in shame. Younger brother, I saw no cheating. The battle was honorable. The first to rebuke him was Julius, the eldest son. With his status as the most likely heir to the duchy, the nobles sided with him in an instant and nodded in agreement. Soon after, the second oldest spoke. Truly pathetic. Theodore said little, but his anger was evident. Arthur and Roland had long been thorns in his side, and their victory was surely not the outcome he had hoped for. Tybalt, however, merely continued clapping with a faint smile, as if he had just witnessed something amusing. Ha, did you see that? One strike and it was over. Though if one of my magic knights had been in that duel, the result would have been very different. Roland looked around and for a moment, worried that he might be seized and thrown into a dungeon. It seemed, however, that the rules governing these events offered him some protection. Even though Ivan continued to protest, the louder he became the more strangely the other nobles regarded him. Eventually, as expected, he turned his head toward Arthur, since Arthur was the only target he could confront without suffering any consequences. You bass! The man tried to shout and rage again, but for some reason he stopped. His wife was firmly holding his hand as if in protest, and he turned to look at her. The gaze was difficult to read from where Roland stood, yet it appeared strange. Soon the red began to fade from the man's face. It seemed the woman had the power to calm this Valerian brother, and she had done so before he made an even greater fool of himself. Arthur, however, seemed ready to exchange harsh words and gloat, although it did not appear he would have the chance. Bah! Ivan did not accept defeat, but instead of fighting he stormed out. Many of those around him followed, although some chose to remain. Now, many eyes were on Arthur, and for the first time since his arrival, people seemed interested in him. Everyone thinks I am a fool. Julius and that bastard, every single one of them refuses to take me seriously. Ivan stormed across the room like a caged animal, his steps uneven, his hands still stained with wine. His face was twisted, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck bulged. He paced back and forth, muttering curses under his breath. The memory of the other nobles' laughter was still vivid, and it drove him closer to madness. Ivan, my dear son, please calm down. Everything will be fine. Lady Scarlet's voice filled the chamber, which had once looked luxurious but now resembled the aftermath of a brawl. A chair lay overturned, plates lay smashed in the corners, and tables had been reduced to splinters. Fist-shaped holes scarred the walls. Her son no longer looked like a noble but like an angry child who had been denied his favorite toy. Scarlet could only frown and shake her head, though she showed no anger at his outburst. Let us calm down for a moment. Not everything is lost yet. She tried to reason with him, but his anger still boiled over. You saw them. Ivan roared like a beast and spun toward her. They laughed at me. At me. As though I were some clown to be mocked while that rusted thing humiliated my knight in front of the entire duchy. He snatched a teacup from one of the few tables still standing and hurled it against the wall. It shattered instantly, and he continued to shout. I am the Duke's son, and they dare laugh at me. I will have all of their heads. His mother sighed in disappointment. Yet he was still her son, and she would not give up on his right to the Duke's position. She stepped closer, cupped his face in her hands, and forced him to meet her gaze. Her eyebrows drew together as she finally revealed that she would not tolerate more of his childish behavior. Ivan Valerian, you stop with this whining now. I did not bring you into this world to watch you throw tantrums like a child. Lady Scarlet's voice cracked like a whip across the wrecked chamber. Ivan froze for a moment, but the anger in his face did not vanish. He was ready to throw another object at the wall when a hand smacked his cheek. Mother! I told you to stop. She would not accept a refusal. After releasing her grip on his other cheek, she struck him with her opposite hand. For someone like Ivan, a Tier 3 class holder, the pain was little more than a sting. Yet the wild look in his mother's eyes brought back memories from the past, and he instantly quieted down. When silence finally returned, Scarlet's frown softened, and she let go of his face. Good, that's better. Lady Scarlet's voice softened, though the force behind it remained. She smoothed the sleeve of her gown and let a smile return to her face. You think tonight is ruined because of one duel? Fools laugh, Ivan. Let them laugh, let them choke on it. In the end, we will have the last laugh. For now, wipe that look from your face and get ready to return. We can't have a duke candidate not take part in the assembly. It was not a request. It was an order, and Ivan, a man who never accepted orders from anyone, lowered his eyes. Yes, mother. That is my son. She adjusted his clothes and brushed her knuckles across his cheek. The event is not finished. When your father arrives, his will shall be the only voice that matters in this hall. Do you understand? Ivan's jaw tightened. His lips trembled. The humiliation still burned in his chest, but his mother's words gave him something to hold on to. I will crush them. He muttered, a trace of rage still in his eyes. No. Lady Scarlet shook her head. Not yet. Until you wear the ducal mantle you will not touch them. Not a single one. Do you hear me? He swallowed and forced the answer out. Without the title of duke, he had no power over the nobles gathered there. They lived under his house's banner, but authority would not be his until the mantle was placed on his shoulders. He understood this. What about that bastard? Not even him, not until we see what your father intends to do with him. Yes, mother. Behind them, his wife stood in silence, her presence as delicate as ever. She did not speak, and she did not interrupt. When Scarlet's fiery eyes swept over her, she bowed her head, then shifted slightly toward the door. Neither Ivan nor his mother noticed or cared as she slipped away. The moment she stepped into the hall, her demeanor changed. What seemed to be a gaze filled with compassion and warmth was replaced with vitriol. The mask of a dutiful wife slipped away quite easily. Her steps were careful and did not generate any sound at all. At the end of the corridor, a servant boy lingered in shadow, waiting as though he had anticipated her. She produced a folded letter from her sleeve and passed it into his hands. Her voice, no louder than a whisper, carried the weight of command. Deliver this. No one must see you. The servant's eyes didn't change, he just bowed once, clutching the letter to his chest. Without a word, he disappeared into the shadows of the manor, vanishing as though he had never been there. The Duchess's daughter-in-law exhaled softly, gathering herself before she returned, her expression shifting once more into that of a meek, loyal wife. Meanwhile, back in the arena, the nobles had gathered in clusters, whispering amongst themselves like a flock of birds. Some praised Roland's astounding display, others whispered suspiciously about his mysterious power, and more than a few began to reconsider their alliances. Arthur rose to his feet and set his glass onto a tray that a servant carried away. By now, Roland was making his way back toward him, while Hadrian had already been removed from the arena. The rusty armor was gone, replaced by his earlier attire, which made him stand out less, though many eyes still followed him. The nobles gazed at him as if he were a prized horse, one they longed to claim for their own service. Sir Wayland, what a magnificent duel! Quite the good show you put on, good Sir Knight. Would you be interested in having a chat? Some nobles called out to him as he passed, but he gave no reply. The mask concealed his face, and he moved steadily through the crowd. Their expressions soured at the cold shoulder, yet he understood their frustration was not truly directed at him. By ignoring their greetings, he made it clear that their behavior was an affront to Arthur. Their true aim was to lure him to their side, and such attempts were rarely carried out so openly. You had me worried for a moment there, Sir Wayland. My apologies, my lord. Arthur's lips curved into a measured smile as Roland joined him. With his knight at his side, it was finally Arthur's moment to speak. Every eye turned toward him. Some of the nobles who had lingered around Yvonne still remained, while others who had kept neutral now began to show interest. "A toast to my knight, for giving us such a fine display," Arthur declared, lifting a tall glass of wine. The nobles smiled and began to gather closer. Their curiosity had been piqued, and Arthur knew this was the time to reel them in. "Here, here. Indeed, here, here." One of the older counts echoed, his mustache trembling as he raised his cup. The nobles around him followed suit, their voices joining in reluctant but growing cheer. Crystal clinked, wine sloshed, and Arthur's toast became the event on which the mood of the hall turned. Mostly the younger lords stepped forward, many of them hired retainers or the children of local nobility, but for Arthur this was enough. This was his chance to gain a foothold. If he could win the favor of some of these people, the possibilities for future business would be immense. Nobles were naturally capricious, and they usually preferred to form alliances with those they liked or with those who showed promise. Arthur now needed to convince them that he was a worthwhile investment. "Lord Arthur," a young man said. "Who is this, Sir Wayland? His strength is quite dazzling. Even a Valyrian knight, famed for his aura, could not stand against him." Another noble chimed in, his tone conveying both awe and suspicion. "Does he train in some secret knight order? That strike at the end, my word!" It was as though the heavens themselves had lent him strength. Arthur chuckled as he gestured casually toward Roland, who remained still, mask hiding his features, giving him the image of a silent sentinel. "My Sir Wayland," Arthur said, his tone amused. "He is not as mysterious as you make him out to be. He is just a man of loyalty, discipline, and unyielding will, but—" Arthur trailed off at the end. "But—" The nobles leaned in, curious about how such a powerful knight had appeared out of nowhere. Relations between high-ranking nobles and their knights were unique, bound by loyalty, sworn oaths, and at times even bloodlines. Some nobles would offer their daughters to exceptionally strong knights to preserve those bonds. For someone to acquire a figure like Sir Wayland without any rumor or record of his existence seemed unimaginable. Their imaginations ran wild, and the mask that concealed his face led them to believe he might be a fallen noble, perhaps from another country, who had once reached the pinnacle of knighthood but was now forced to retreat into the service of Arthur, a man in need of aid. Arthur had expected such speculation, and he chose to embrace it. Arthur let the silence linger for just a moment, the faint curl of his lips suggesting he knew more than he was willing to say. A single pause, carefully timed, was all it took for the assembled nobles to hang upon his next word. "But perhaps this is not a conversation we should have here in the arena, where blood was just spilled. Let us return inside and continue our discussion there." The nobles glanced around, some nodding in agreement while others scanned the crowd as if afraid someone might be listening. Before long they moved back indoors and gathered around Arthur, who was finally drawing attention to himself in a favorable way. They chose a more private booth, which naturally attracted even more curiosity, and soon a small circle of nobility was enthralled by Arthur's tale of how Sir Wayland came to his abode. "He certainly knows how to sound convincing." Roland stayed close behind him, occasionally flexing his hand or entertaining a few nobles with small displays of magic while Arthur continued the story of how they met. Much of it was invented, yet some details were rooted in truth. He concealed his true identity and instead claimed that he had discovered him in the forest, beaten, bruised, and without memory. It was a tale that no one should have believed, yet it carried just enough truth to sound convincing. He admitted that his knight-to-be had once worked as a blacksmith, though he downplayed his talent for controlling runes and suggested that most of their advancements had come from people like Bernir or the Dwarven Union. He spoke of the magic city of Albrook, a place filled with runic marvels that most could only dream of. The nobles pressed him with questions, but instead of answering, he withheld details and invited them to visit his estate if they wished to see more. In doing so, he planted a seed of curiosity in every listener, a clever move that soon made him the center of conversation throughout the gathering. As time passed, Roland grew restless, standing idly in the corner while the nobles drank more heavily, and Arthur joined in. The conversation shifted in many directions, and before long, some of the guests began to warm to Arthur as a legitimate noble. He had managed to create the possibility of being seen as worthy, yet without the Duke's approval, most of them would likely continue to keep their distance. "When will this assembly even start? It's almost nighttime." A lot of time had passed, but the Duke had not made his appearance. The assembly could not begin without him, and some of the other nobles started to appear restless. The murmurs spread like ripples through a pond. Cups clinked as nobles began to drink less out of joy and more out of impatience. Some glanced toward the doors at the far end of the hall, ones leading to the castle's inner quarters where the duke resided. Others whispered about the duke's absence, wondering if something had transpired that they were not aware of. Where is he? The duke never keeps us waiting this long. Has something happened? Speculation festered. Every passing minute felt heavier than the last. Even Arthur noticed that his carefully spun momentum began to waver as attention shifted back to the elephant in the room, the missing patriarch of House Valerian. Roland, however, remained still like a stone, his masked face betraying nothing. He used this time to analyze everything and steady his mind. When things like this happened, it usually did not end well, and he wanted to be prepared if matters turned against them. As he was calculating their escape route, the doors that had been shut for almost the entire day finally swung open. The massive doors at the end of the hall groaned as they moved, their hinges straining beneath the weight of ancient oak and mystic metal. A hush spread instantly among the nobles as they realized it was finally time. Every head turned, and every gaze was now fixated on the figure who now entered the chamber. It was the Duke, the leader of House Valerian. Alexander Valerian entered in garments of deep crimson and black, embroidered with threads of gold that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. A long cloak, made out of snow-white fur, trailed behind him. At first glance, he still carried the dignity of a ruler, tall, broad-shouldered, a body that had once been the envy of warriors and nobles alike. His silvery white hair gleamed, perfectly combed, his mustache immaculately styled, and yet... something is wrong. Roland listened as the nobles erupted into cheers. Relief and reverence filled their voices. Many of them were already drunk, yet once the Duke appeared, they miraculously seemed to recover. Cups were raised and toasts rang out in his honor, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. However, while the hall celebrated, Roland's sensors told him a different story. There is something off. Is he wearing something to conceal his true face? Roland's eyes narrowed behind his mask. His gaze traced every detail of the Duke's movements. Something about them felt wrong. This was not how a Tier 4 class holder was supposed to carry himself. Roland had met several in his life and they all exuded a distinct aura. The Duke's presence was diminished, as though he were injured or not in full health. His face seemed to be covered with something, as if he did not want these people to see the condition of his skin. To most, his walk appeared steady and dignified, but to Roland and perhaps a few other high-level Tier 3 class holders, the flaws were obvious. The majority of the crowd remained blinded by the Duke's striking appearance. Even Arthur failed to notice anything unusual about his father as the man stepped forward to make an announcement. The sluggishness in his movements was ignored, perhaps out of fear of speaking aloud what they saw. Roland could not tell exactly what was happening, yet his attention was caught by secretive glances and shifting figures. Those he had already marked as potential enemies were beginning to move. Some slipped behind columns, others reached into their pockets. Something was beginning, and Roland doubted it was the Duke's will. There he is. Get ready and remember what I told you. Yes, Mother. Yvonne nodded slightly as the door to the assembly hall began to open. The nobles around him turned their attention toward the entrance, with one exception, his wife. The Duchess's daughter-in-law lingered a step behind the others, as if her status were beneath theirs. Her gaze fixed on the great door in the distance, but soon it drifted to the sides where other eyes were waiting to meet hers. It is time. She thought while taking a small step backward. The nobles standing nearby were too absorbed by the Duke's entrance to notice her slipping away. Even her husband Ivan, who seemed captivated by her beauty, did not turn his head. His focus remained on his father, the overlord of the island and the man who dictated the fate of everyone who lived there. She turned and drifted into the dim corridors of the Valerian manor. Each stride was unervingly precise, as if she glided along the floor rather than walked upon it. The guards stationed nearby gave no sign of noticing her presence, as though their eyes refused to acknowledge her passage along the walls. She moved faster now, her skirts brushing the stone walls, her breath steady and measured. Yet her heart pounded with dark excitement. This was her moment to rise, her only chance to prove to the others that she belonged in her position. Your priestess commands you to come forth. The time has come to prove your worth. From the shadows, something began to emerge. The stone walls shifted in unnatural ways, bending like cloth. Occult symbols flickered faintly across the surface before a figure pulled itself free of the rock. Archpriestess. We come to serve the abyss. The voice was low and rasping, neither wholly male nor female. It unsettled the air, but more disturbing still was the fact that it was not alone. More shadows appeared, peeling away from the castle walls as if they had lingered there for ages. Their forms were concealed beneath dark robes and masks fashioned with twisting tentacles, each bearing a single large eye at the center. The woman, once known only as Ivan's meek wife, lifted her chin as the first robed figure bowed before her. The veil that had hidden her features slipped to the floor, revealing a cruel smile. Her bright violet eyes gleamed as her gown shifted and reshaped into the garb of a cultist, the vestments of one who served the god of the abyss. Her gown shifted as if alive, transforming into flowing abyssal robes. What had once been lace and finery became heavy fabric etched with faint, shifting symbols. The patterns twisted into eyes that opened and blinked across her sleeves. A mantle of shadow draped over her shoulders, fastened by living tentacles that writhed in silence. At her waist, cords of black thread bound the garment, pulsing faintly like veins. For a brief moment, her face was bare, but then a mask slid into place over her eyes. From beneath it, an unsettling violet glow radiated, pulsing in rhythm with her voice each time she spoke. From her presence alone, the chamber grew colder, as though the abyss itself had seeped into the world through her very robes. The robed figures bent low before the woman, their voices joining in a whispered chorus that slithered across the stone corridors like snakes. For the abyss, we bleed. For the abyss, we serve. All is for the everlasting dream. Her smile deepened as she watched their loyalty to the abyss and to the glorious one. She raised a pale hand, and the whispers fell silent. Only the fading rays of the setting sun remained, casting long shadows across the cultists' masks. Do you have the secret relics? She addressed one of the cloaked men, the first to step forward. His mask was different from the rest, marked with 3 eyes instead of 1. Yes, Archpriestess. The man straightened and drew a small obelisk from within his robe. Its power was still dormant, yet the occult runes glowed faintly, ready to awaken. Though small, it radiated a strange force. He was not the only one. Soon many others revealed the same relics, each identical to the first. Well done. The Duke is a powerful man. Even weakened, he may still find a way to escape the grand dream world. Follow the plan. Place the relics at the agreed locations and wait for my signal. As you wish, Archpriestess. The grin never left her face. At last, it was time to prove her worth. Everything depended on this day, yet failure was not something she allowed herself to consider. Either she would succeed or she would perish. In her mind, the Lord of the Abyss would never let her die a useless death. And if she did, it would be by his will, for through him the endless dream they longed for would one day come to pass. The masked cultists soon faded away, their shadowy forms slipping into the walls. The nobles were too busy cheering for the Duke to notice what was about to unfold. Truly pathetic. She whispered to herself as she made her way back to the grand hall. Not a single person paid her any attention. Everything was proceeding with ease, and she knew the years spent trapped in this cesspool of nobility were about to end. After today, she would finally be free. Free from the role of the beautiful, silent wife, free from Ivan, free from his fool of a mother. They will all become one with the abyss. Once this island belongs to us, my place on the council will be secured, and I will at last ascend. Oh, what a glorious day! The woman cackled, her laughter echoing through the chamber. She did not care if the nobles heard her. This was her moment. With one of the secret relics clutched in her hand, she had nothing to fear. She stepped forward at a slow, deliberate pace before speaking again. Truly disgusting. The hall fell silent. Her words slid through the vast chamber like venom, silencing even the Duke and freezing the nobles in place. Faces shifted from shock to confusion. Some shrank back instinctively, while others swelled with outrage at the audacity of a woman speaking so boldly in the Duke's presence. What is the meaning of this? Someone remove her at once. Ivan's mother leaned in and whispered to the nobles nearby. One of them gave a sharp nod. Many did not recognize the woman in her new attire, but she did. A man stepped forward, reaching to seize the intruder's wrist. Just as his fingers were about to close around her, he was struck. A tentacle burst from her shadowed cloak, lashing out and hurling him against the stone wall with a heavy crack. The man's eyes rolled back as he crumpled to the floor, blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. Gasps tore through the chamber. Some nobles stumbled back while others shrieked, their composure shattering like glass. A few guards surged forward, their blades flashing in the chandelier's glow as a heavy darkness settled over the hall. Pathetic. The archpriestess did not flinch. She stood tall, her blindfolded gaze sweeping across the room. She was intoxicated by their fear, and her voice rang out to silence everyone. Pathetic creatures! You strut in your wealth, drown yourselves in wine, and call it power. But what are you really? Fattened lambs waiting for the butcher. You disgust me. Yet do not despair, for once you embrace the gifts of the Lord, you will all be saved. The nobles broke free of their trance and raised their voices in protest. Guards lunged forward with swords ready. In answer, she lifted her hand. The small obelisk she held blazed with light, runes spiraling across its surface. A strange hum shook the very bones of those present before bursting outward in a pulse of unseen force. Thrum! The wave slammed through the hall like a thunderclap, resonating with multiple sound waves that came from other directions. Nobles froze mid-breath, crystal goblets trembling in their hands, mouths parted in half-formed cries. Guards halted mid-strike, their blades hovering just short of her robes, every muscle bound by invisible chains. Even the Duke stiffened, his proud stance crumbling as he collapsed to the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Only the faint sound of the obelisk lingered, resonating through the chamber like the heartbeat of some vast, unseen creature. Good. That is better. Her tone softened, mockingly sweet, as though she were addressing frightened children. She smoothed her sleeves, her cruel smile widening. You have lived too long in your golden cages, thinking yourselves untouchable. But your laughter, your schemes, your titles, they mean nothing. Soon, you will all join us in the eternal abyss. You will dream forever, as all must, and your hollow empire will be forgotten. She strode among the frozen nobles, trailing her fingers across their stiff shoulders and rigid cheeks. Wherever she touched, their flesh quivered grotesquely, as if resisting some unseen corruption. Some of you may struggle, but it is meaningless before the great Lord of the Abyss. His descent cannot be stopped. Once we are united, your pride, your lineage, and all your wealth will be reduced to nothing. Her words dripped like sweet poison, but none could answer. They could not protest or agree. They were caught in an illusion, helpless, waiting for her to finish her task. From within a spatial item, she drew a jagged dagger shaped like a black tentacle, its hilt adorned with a blinking eye. Her first target was the Duke. Even bound by the sacred relic, his strength remained dangerous. He had to die. The archpriestess raised the dagger high, her shadow stretching across the marble floor. Her laughter rang through the hall, echoing against the frozen forms of the nobles. She savored the silence and the helplessness of those who had once sneered at her. Every noble belonged to her now. Soon, they would be infected and truly claimed by the Abyss. Do you see, my Lord of the Abyss? She whispered, her violet eyes blazing beneath the mask. They are yours already. And I, your chosen hand, will be remembered as the one who opened the gate and began it all. She spun across the dance floor, brushing into the motionless nobles and laughing when they toppled. Her twisted smile widened as she surrendered herself to victory. The archpriestess spun with manic delight, her abyssal robes swirling, her dagger flashing in the light of the chandeliers. Then she stopped, her laughter breaking off, as she noticed something. Was that person always standing there? A lone figure in a strange mask stood somewhere they shouldn't, as she was almost certain he had been elsewhere moments ago. It was the knight of the fool called Arthur, the same man who had defeated the greater fool Yvonne. She had to admit that he was strong, perhaps even capable of becoming an abyssal priest. Yet she could not understand why he stood here when he should have been trapped elsewhere. The bastard's dog? Am I imagining things? She muttered as she stepped toward him. The man gave no reply. He stood as still as stone, like all the others ensnared by the relic's illusion. Everything should have been fine, yet her instincts whispered that something was wrong. Her grip tightened on the dagger as she approached with cautious curiosity. Resisting the secret relic is not something someone at this level should be capable of. She spoke while pressing the dark blade against his cheek. She drew it slowly to the side, carving a shallow gash. Blood surged and ran down his skin, but he did not move, confirming to her that he was caught within the illusion. I should not doubt the Lord's miracles. There was no reason to remain, so she turned away, and her gaze shifted back to her true target, the Duke. Soon she was taking a few steps forward, but then froze. This time it was not a hunch. This was real. Her senses screamed. She was in danger. Without thinking, she swung her dagger at something behind her. As she spun around, the man with a wound on his cheek blocked her strike. Her wrist was caught firmly in his palm, a clear testament to his strength. Yet this was not what held her attention. It was his other hand that glowed with a bright light. Something was forming there, something that resembled armor made of obsidian. How did? Before she could finish, a punch crashed into her face. The obsidian fist struck her cheek with a sound like shattering porcelain. Her flawless, pale skin cracked apart, and she was hurled through the air. Fragments of her face mask scattered as she flew, revealing the truth beneath her beauty. It had never been her real face but a lifelike mask concealing the being hidden underneath. Her body slammed into the wall with a heavy thud, sending dust and broken stone raining down. For a moment, she did not rise. Her abyssal robes writhed like snakes in agony, their tendrils curling inward as if to shield her injured form. Slowly, she pushed herself upright, breathing in ragged gasps and unable to comprehend the situation. "Why you?" The archpriestess touched her face with trembling fingers. The porcelain mask that had concealed her for years was splitting apart, shards falling one by one. Beneath the broken pieces lay not the beauty she flaunted in court but the twisted visage of a withered crow. Her skin was dry and gnarled, stretched tight over sharp bones. Her nose jutted down like a beak, casting shadow over a mouth stretched unnaturally wide and filled with blackened teeth. Her violet eyes still burned fiercely, but they were sunken into a grotesque husk. "A witch!" The man's voice echoed through the grand hall. She glared at him, biting her lip until her sharpened teeth drew thick black blood. "Impossible! How could you resist the holy relic?" Her voice cracked into a scream, spittle and blood spraying from her mouth. Where it landed on the marble floor, it hissed and smoked, filling the hall with a foul stench. "You mean this thing?" "Quite easily. How did you?" She looked down at her hand. Just moments before, the secret relic had been within her grasp, but now it was in his. His body shimmered and shifted as radiant light filled the hall, until a massive suit of dark armor enveloped him completely. "Give it back." "Sure. Here you go." To her surprise, the man tossed the obelisk toward her. She lunged forward and snatched it out of the air with superhuman speed, clutching it as tenderly as a newborn. But something was wrong. The abyssal magic that had once pulsed from it was gone. The occult runes no longer answered her call. The relic was silent, deactivated. Her eyes darted back to him, but he had already moved. He now stood beside the bastard. At first, she did not understand what he intended, but then something impossible happened. Arthur Valerian awoke. Inconceivable. Her faith in the abyssal cult's magic and relics had never wavered, yet two people had now resisted their power. The truth became undeniable. This man was the cause of everything. Kovac, whom she had sent to investigate, had never returned, and his fate remained unknown. The growing presence of the Solarian Church in Albrook had seemed suspicious, but she had assumed it was related to the sacred beast that had appeared there. The disappearance of the cultists who pursued that anomaly had never been explained, until now. She was staring at the answer. The man before her was not only responsible for the relic's deactivation but also for the loss of their foothold in Rika. Her withered lips curled back in a snarl, black blood dribbling from the corners of her mouth. The archpriestess's skeletal hands gripped the useless relic until cracks ran along its surface. She trembled with rage, and her skinny frame started to expand. "You dare! You dare strip me of my lord's gift!" Her voice had changed, it was no longer the voice of the Duchess's daughter-in-law, but the cracked screeching of something ancient and vile. Abyssal resonance detected. Activating anti-illusion protocols. Initializing wake-up protocol. Please stand by. Thin lines of text flickered across Roland's visor. His eyes remained still at first, but then a faint flash appeared, followed by a sound only his ears could detect. Within seconds, his pupils began to dilate. Wake-up protocol successful. Roland blinked a few times at the text hovering before his eyes. His body remained motionless as laughter echoed around him. A voice rang out, loud and frenzied, as someone shouted proclamations to their so-called abyssal god. He understood immediately what had happened. For a brief moment, he had been pulled into the familiar illusory space conjured by cultists he had fought many times before, but this time he was prepared. Once free of the illusion, he activated his debugging skill to be certain. No runes glowed in the world around him, and that confirmed his protection had worked. What he saw next was troubling. One of the abyssal cultists danced about, lost in a villainous monologue, while everyone else in the chamber, including the Duke, remained trapped in the illusion. Roland quickly assessed the situation. The woman held a miniature obelisk in her hand, a perfect replica of the one he had first encountered at Exier's Magic Emporium. Back then he had been powerless to stop the cult assassins, but now the circumstances were different. He knew how to block the signal, and the simplest method was also the most direct. The obelisk had to be destroyed. This was his chance to strip it from her, but there was one problem. He did not have his true rune armor on. If he transformed now, she would clearly see him. To make matters worse, he detected outside presences along with multiple sources of cult corruption. Nevertheless, he needed to get closer because without proper rune armor, he would not be able to awaken the people around him. After activating several enchantments to conceal his presence, he moved forward. Step by step, he approached the strange woman who was prancing around, and eventually, he stood directly in front of the path she was taking. At this time, she finally noticed something and approached. Her dagger pressed against his cheek and drew blood. He felt multiple curses being applied, but his body resisted them. The moment he saw an opening, he struck. As soon as she realized his presence, he began summoning his armor set, the one forged from Terranite and named Onyx. Its form was bulkier than his other suits, making his body appear much larger and giving him the appearance of being covered in polished black stone. The fabric on his arm tore away, revealing the silver-grey suit he had been wearing beneath. Once enough of the armor had formed, he drove his fist forward and struck the woman who had been masquerading as Ivan's wife. To his surprise, her face shattered, and her true form was revealed, but he did not waste time staring. His focus turned to the mini obelisk that now rested in his hand. Shit! With it in his grasp, he could only frown because his first plan could not be completed. Even though he had secured the device and could disable it, the effect would not end. Now that more of his armor had formed, his computing power increased, and his scanning range expanded in all directions. He quickly realized there were multiple illusory devices. Even if one was destroyed, the others would continue the signal. The only reason he had not fallen back under the illusion was that his gear was built to resist and block such effects. If he wanted to awaken anyone else, he would need to protect them in the same way. Some people might be able to resist with a little bit of help. Roland assessed the situation quickly. The cult member was still scraping herself off the wall, but he was already on the move. A few people nearby could assist him, most notably the knight commanders who had accompanied Arthur's brothers. Each of them was a high-tier, third-class holder. He also considered the Duke, who stood a tier above the others, but something about him was off. The Duke felt much weaker than he should have, which meant he would be of little use in this fight. The better option was to target his personal knights, who were positioned around him. Why you? At this point, the woman managed to recover, but it became painfully clear to him that she was something different, a dark witch. This was another class, one that occult beings and people who followed dark magic could achieve, similar to the warlock class. It granted great strength and an extended lifespan, but at the cost of leaving its wielder disfigured. Her appearance resembled a monster more than a human. After a brief exchange, he tossed the useless relic in her direction to distract her. He then bolted to the side toward his first target. Several choices were available to him, such as the powerful Tier 3 class holders who could likely defend themselves. Even with these options, Roland did not approach them first. Instead, he went to the only person among them he could fully trust, Arthur. Although Roland's current armor was bulkier than the other runic ones, his speed could not be underestimated. He moved even while parts of the armor were still assembling, and with a few great leaps, he appeared beside his friend. There was no time to waste. The cultist woman shouted something in the background, but he ignored her. On Arthur's left hand rested a ring that appeared ordinary yet had been altered by runic enhancements for moments exactly like this. He touched it and let his mana flow into the runes, shifting them rapidly. The strange tones emitted by the occult relics needed to be countered continuously, and though difficult, it was possible. With his armor now fully assembled, he could maintain the countermeasure and act as a hub that connected to Arthur's ring. He performed the computations to deflect the attacks, while the ring received the signal and activated the blocking enchantment whenever needed. The armor he wore was much bulkier than the rest, and its greatest strength lay in its durability and close combat effectiveness. Although made of metal, it resembled polished dark marble, with runes that looked like cracks running across its surface. The shoulders were heavier than usual, and the same was true of the arms and legs. His helmet was rounded with a narrow red visor, and a jutting jaw mask with side slits that allowed him to breathe more easily. Yet the most striking feature of the armor was not its bulk or design but what extended from its back. Four mechanical limbs jutted outward, each ending not in hands or weapons but in massive slabs of metal. They were incredibly thick and forged from a custom alloy strong enough to withstand nearly any strike. You dare? You dare strip me of my lord's gift? The witch screamed as her transformation began. Her limbs lengthened and her hands twisted into grotesque shapes, yet he could not turn to watch. His focus had to remain on Arthur and the ring that circled his finger. The connection is set. It is now or never. He had prepared everything in advance, and within moments the wake-up call surged through. Arthur's eyes snapped open. His pupils dilated before he regained awareness. Hey? Sir Wayland, is that you? Even in his disoriented state, Arthur used the cover name, which was something to be grateful for. I don't have time to explain. It is an abyssal cult situation. Here, take this. Arthur hesitated for a heartbeat, but at the mention of the cult, his expression hardened. He understood at once and stared down at the objects placed in his hands. Give these bracelets to any powerful combatants you can find. The 3 knight commanders who serve your brothers would be excellent choices. I will hold this witch off. My golems will guide you to the other obelisks. We need to destroy them all to wake everyone. I activated the rune on your other ring, it contains your swords. Now go. Roland spoke as quickly as he could, summoning several of his floating golems from the dark backplate on his armor. They scattered through the hall, some of them hovering low to shield the nobles. He held no fondness for these people, but many of them were still young and did not deserve to die. He did not know how powerful the witch truly was or how many cultists had managed to slip into the castle. The relics were the true danger. If they were destroyed, the soldiers would wake and fight, but until then, they remained helpless. I will not allow the Great One's plan to be disturbed. All of you will join the eternal dream. The woman behind it all was Ivan's so-called wife. Roland could not tell whether she had enthralled him from the beginning or had only taken on the appearance of his wife, but in the end, it made no difference. Her current form was monstrous. Her lower limbs had split apart and multiplied, twisting into a spider-like structure. She had become an arachnid horror with a warped humanoid torso rising grotesquely from its abdomen. Multiple eyes bulged from her twisted frame, and a gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth tore open across her humanoid abdomen. Her legs ended in sharp points of bone that pierced the stone floor beneath her. When the transformation was complete, a piercing shriek burst from her second mouth as she lunged forward with reckless abandon. Roland surged forward to meet her, and 2 massive maces appeared in each of his hands. Their collision sent tremors through the castle, splitting the stone floor and hurling many of the frozen nobles aside. Roland's golems moved quickly, projecting shields and casting protective wards to soften their fall. His mace struck her side and sent her crashing across the floor. The witch screeched and spat a yellowish acid from her smaller mouth. It shot toward him, but before it could land, 2 of his robotic arms snapped together. They formed a rectangular shield of thick metal slabs. When the acid splashed against it, the surface hissed and sizzled, yet the shield held firm, and the fight raged on. Arthur gripped the bracelets tightly. The cold metal shifted faintly in his hands as the runes flared with light. He cast one final glance at his friend, already locked in combat with the spider witch, then turned sharply away. There was no time to waste. Every moment the obelisks remained untouched meant that the nobles and their knights stayed trapped in a dream that would soon consume them. Will this one guide me? A small golem appeared before him and gave a single flash in response. Arthur nodded and sprinted toward the first person he had to awaken. That person could not be mistaken. A towering figure in black plate armor, with barehead pauldrons and a flowing cape. The bestial warden, Theodore's most trusted champion. Even frozen in mid-motion, his presence was overwhelming. The man had raised one colossal arm to shield his brother, who stood beside him in the same unmoving trance. For a moment, Arthur hesitated. This was the brother with whom he had quarreled most often. Now his most powerful retainer stood helpless. His 2 swords were with him, the very ones Roland had forged before their arrival. Arthur knew that with one strike, one problem would vanish forever. Theodore was defenseless, and no one bound inside the illusion would ever know who had done it. I am going to regret this. He frowned, then chose to act. He lifted the bracelet and reached up, straining to clasp it around the warden's wrist. The knight was a giant of the Goliath race, and Arthur's arm barely reached. The runes pulsed once, then flared with a bright light as the enchantment was activated. Wake up! Arthur commanded, and suddenly, the massive man's chest heaved. His eyes widened as he staggered forward and looked around. What sorcery is this? He was confused and demanded answers. Occult arts. Arthur called back. Protect your master and the others. Enemies are coming. Without waiting for a reply, Arthur was already moving. The witch might have been the greatest threat, but she was not alone. Her minions were beginning to crawl out of hidden places, ready to strike the moment the plan faltered. Arthur sprinted across the marble floor, his boots striking sharply against the cracked stone. The spider witch's screeches echoed behind him and mixed with the thunderous crashes of Roland's maces as they collided with chitin and bone. Each blow sent out a resounding bang that rattled the windows, and Arthur had to duck aside more than once when chairs were hurled his way. At first, he was unsure about the order in which he was awakening people. Normally, his father would have been the best option for this fight, but as he looked around, the choice did make some sense. The order created a path forward with the ultimate goal being the Duke and his guards. He had multiple bracelets and could ignore his brothers and their aides if he wished. Even so, they were still his brothers, although he disliked Yvonne and Theodore, the thought of letting the other two die unsettled him. With that in mind, he decided to push forward quickly and focused on his next target. The golem at his side pulsed again, urging him forward. Ahead lay their next target and perhaps their strongest potential ally, Lady Bernadette of the Dawn. She appeared unremarkable at first glance, yet Arthur knew she was a powerful paladin of the Solarian Church. If anyone could be trusted to stand against the abyssal cultists, it was her, and perhaps also his brother. He hesitated for a moment before pulling out two bracelets. One he snapped onto Lady Bernadette's wrist, and the other onto Julius. Although Arthur still held mixed feelings about this brother of his, Julius was far better than Theodore, and more importantly, he was a Tier 3 class paladin who could aid them in this fight. That was what mattered most now, and time was almost up. For the abyss. Just as the two bracelets were secured on his wrists, a cultist lunged at Arthur. The blade whistled through the air, aimed directly at his throat. Before the strike could land, Arthur's rapier intercepted it. Sparks of aura and magic scattered as he parried the blow and forced some distance between them. From within his spatial ring he drew a second heavy rapier, and soon the two were locked in a furious exchange of strikes. For Arthur, this was the first real fight against an enemy determined to kill him. Roland was not there to protect him, and the two who could help were still waking up from the haze of the illusion. They were disoriented, and Arthur knew that in only a few moments, his life might be decided. He had to face this battle alone. Look for an opening. I need an opening. Arthur staggered back under the pressure of the hooded swordsman. The man was a Tier 3 class holder, and though his level was higher, the class he relied on was not especially suited for this fight. Life and death hung in the balance. Both rapiers in Arthur's hands glowed with concentrated aura, and when he saw his chance, he struck without hesitation. Thanks to his dual Meister passive, his proficiency with rapiers had increased. In one-on-one duels, this class of his truly shone. Aura gathered on his blade as he thrust forward while at the same time blocking the cultist's attack with his other rapier. The duel ended as quickly as it began. Arthur's thrust pierced through the cultist's defense, slipping into a gap in the man's dark leather armor. The blade sank deep, aura burning through flesh and bone. The cultist let out a maniacal cry, his hood falling back to reveal a mask covered with writhing tentacles and a single large eye. Yes, I did it. Wait, something is wrong. Arthur sensed danger and immediately pulled his rapier out of the man's chest. He was certain that his strike had pierced the man's heart, yet the cultist was not fully dead. The mask had activated. Tentacles burrowed into his temples, and his body began to twist and change. Arthur knew this transformation would only produce a far deadlier foe, and he refused to allow it. He summoned every bit of aura he could muster. The blades forged by Roland glowed with runes, amplifying the crimson light of his aura. His opponent's form was shifting, sprouting multiple limbs and taking on the shape of an insect. Arthur pressed forward, determined to cut him down before the transformation could be completed. Arthur's rapiers became a blur and appeared as twin streaks of red light cutting through the air. He pressed forward with relentless precision, directing all his strength toward the mask. It was the core of the transformation and the only way to stop it. In a single motion, he slipped past the half-insect, half-human monster. Crimson lines spread across the mask, and with a violent surge of aura energy, it split apart. Sounds of battle filled the grand chamber, but most eyes were drawn to a scream that was not entirely human. After a cultist's mask split apart, his body convulsed violently. The half-formed limbs snapped back into his torso as if dragged by invisible hooks. His flesh writhed and then collapsed inward, leaving behind nothing more than a smoking husk of blackened meat. Arthur staggered back, gasping for air, his rapiers trembling in his hands. The heat of aura still burned against his palms, and his arms felt like lead. I did it. The ground beneath him quaked. Across the chamber, Roland and the spider witch collided once again, their strikes leaving holes in the stone floor. Sparks and acid flew as Roland's maces hammered against her twisted exoskeleton. His weapons slammed down like falling pillars while his golemic limbs shielded him and the nobles from stray strikes. For a brief moment, Arthur allowed himself to breathe. His gaze was fixed on his first victory after attaining the Tier 3 class. The aura on his blades still blazed as he watched the defeated foe crumble into dust. Yet the battle was far from over. From the side, another enemy rushed toward him, this one also wearing a mask and already twisting into a strange insectoid creature. Ugh! Arthur had no time to recover and had left himself open. He raised his swords in a cross and caught the stinger aimed for his chest. At the same time, he leapt backward, letting the momentum carry him away from the brunt of the strike. The force hurled him across the chamber, and he crashed into one of the massive pillars. His back slammed into the stone, his breath leaving him in a sharp grunt. Cracks split the marble, dust spilling down as his shoulders scraped against the surface. He tightened his grip on the rapiers, refusing to let them fall. The insectoid cultist screeched, mandibles clicking in grotesque rhythm as it lunged toward him again. His instincts screamed at him to fight and not to be distracted by Roland's struggle. The Dual Meister's ability was still active, and his aura flared with renewed force. The monster charged. Arthur rolled aside, boots scraping on the polished stone as the creature's stinger slammed into the pillar he had just left. The entire column shook, flakes of marble raining down as though an earthquake was taking place. I cannot keep relying on others. I am not the same as I was before. Time seemed to slow as Arthur's vision blurred from the impact. The monster was momentarily stuck, its stinger lodged in the pillar. His aura swords burned crimson once more as he struck. One pierced the creature's chest, and the other drove into a malformed eye. This monster was faster, stronger, and already almost fully transformed. The mask the cultist wore had fused with his flesh, and the single eye had split apart into several insect-like orbs. The man had become a grotesque mixture of scorpion and mantis. Arthur's strike sank deep, his aura cutting through the chitin that had merged with the cultist's ribs. The creature let out a shriek that rattled his eardrums, then lunged forward with mantis blades that sliced just millimeters from his throat. Arthur twisted his wrist and dragged one blade sideways, severing the arm at its base before leaping back. I hit the face, but the reaction is different. Even though the monstrosity had lost an arm and been pierced twice, it was still alive. It was now clear that once the transformation took hold, the mask was no longer a weak point. Fortunately, this monster was not invulnerable, and although the wounds in its chest were healing rapidly, the severed arm did not regenerate. Arthur frowned at the realization and pressed on. His aura flared brighter as he lunged again. His footwork was sharp and fluid, carrying him around the monster as he pierced its body again and again while slipping past every counter-strike. He was like a blur, a streak of crimson light weaving between slashing claws and stabbing limbs. His instincts surged within him, guiding his motions as though invisible hands pushed him into the right angles, the right strikes, the right tempo. The monster's screeches rose in pitch as its stinger was slashed and flew to the side. The blades traced lines of red through the air and cut into the hard carapace. Each strike left sizzling wounds that piled upon one another until the monster collapsed and Arthur stopped. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead as he felt his aura waver. He had won again, but his breath was short and more enemies were already approaching. Congratulations! You have leveled up. Text appeared before him, yet he had no time to look at it. His gaze shifted instead to two more transformed cultists lunging toward him. Their robes were torn and their bodies were fully twisted by corruption. One resembled the creature he had just slain, while the other bore an elongated head tipped with a mosquito-like proboscis. Dual Meister's passive skill has been deactivated. The message from the world system echoed in his mind. His skill only functioned when facing a single opponent, and this reminder made it clear that it was no longer active. His swordsmanship felt dulled, the perfect flow of battle that he had enjoyed only moments earlier fading away. I wanted to save it for later but... He still had not used his new ability, High Lord's Aura, a skill that would strengthen his aura-based combat for a short time. These cultists were too strong for him to hold back. His class granted him power, yet he lacked combat experience and the knowledge to wield his skills properly. His stamina, already drained by constant aura use, had dwindled to half. It seemed he had no other choice. I do not have a, hey. Arthur was about to trigger the skill when a massive surge of golden light flooded the chamber, drowning out the insect-like cries of the cultists. He flinched and raised an arm against the brilliance as a radiant pressure swept across the battlefield. The corrupted cultists were struck by a wave of power that burned through their unholy flesh in an instant. A heartbeat later, the source revealed itself. Lady Bernadette of the Dawn had awoken. Her eyes blazed like twin suns, irises suffused with golden fire. The bracelet Arthur had clasped onto her wrist now shone with runic light. In her hands rested a massive two-handed sword, a weapon she had not been carrying before. It was clear that knight commanders were permitted to take their arms into the hall, yet Arthur felt no resentment. If anything, he was relieved, for this woman was likely their strongest weapon in the battle ahead. You dare defile this palace with your filth? Her voice rang out, clear and commanding, echoing through the grand hall. The insectoid cultists shrieked as her holy aura swept over them. Arthur watched in awe as the golden radiance burned straight through their bodies, slicing them apart with terrifying precision. It was not merely light but a divine force that cut as cleanly as any blade. Lady Bernadette raised her great sword high. The runes carved into its steel flared with brilliance that rivaled the sun. A halo of golden radiance burst from her form, expanding outward in a blazing circle. Arthur shielded his eyes for an instant before lowering his arm. The cultists no longer looked his way, every one of them now hurled themselves against her. Julius seems fine too now. Arthur's gaze shifted to his eldest brother standing behind the paladin. A shield-bearing Solaria's sun emblem gleamed in Julius's left hand, while his right already held a longsword. With both Julius and Bernadette awakened, Arthur knew he could press forward and focus on rousing two more allies. His third eldest brother remained still, and beside him his wizard guardian also awaited awakening. Without uttering a word, he moved forward with the remaining bracelets. Roland had only given him these few, and it was up to him to decide who would receive them. Most of the people here were incapable of fighting at a Tier 3 level. Although many nobles went to great lengths to obtain powerful battle classes, very few actually advanced beyond a Tier 2 class. They usually left the fighting to their knights, but none of them were present at the moment. The most powerful fighters were the knight commanders who had come with his brothers, along with the guards that surrounded his father. Ivan could not be trusted, and his knight had been injured in the previous duel. That left only his brothers and their guards. He had already decided to avoid Theodore, since he simply could not trust him. It was better to keep the giant man from taking orders from Theodore, as he was certain his brother would choose retreat and prioritize his own life over everyone else's. Tybalt, on the other hand, was also a mage, and with the help of his wizard companion, he could be relied upon to provide supporting fire. He soon made his way toward them while radiant aura swords clashed against the enemy. The paladin lady fought fiercely, and thanks to her efforts, he was able to head over towards his brother. To aid him in his mission, one of the golems Roland had sent out concealed his presence. He felt the weight of a concealment spell settle over him, and with his enemies distracted he managed to reach his brother. The golem then ascended into the sky as though it were keeping watch, although it was more likely serving as an additional set of eyes for his ally. Once both bracelets were clasped in place, he waited for their clarity to return before speaking about what was taking place. What? Abyssal cultists? Indeed. Keep the bracelets on. They are the only thing preventing you from falling under the illusion. Once I awaken Father, we must destroy the relics that are creating this magic. Protect the other nobles in the meantime. Arthur was already running while shouting to his fourth brother. Not far away, he saw Lady Bernadette cut down another twisted cultist. Her great sword blazed with golden radiance as she swung in a wide arc, and the sheer force of her aura attack split the polished marble beneath her feet. His brother Julius stood beside her, not fighting but simply observing. The bestial warden, on the other hand, was tearing through the enemy without pause. Some of the cultists climbed onto his back in an attempt to bite him, yet his massive frame only swelled with power as he hurled them off. His body seemed forged from mithril itself. With every strike, he crushed skulls and cleared the way, defending his sleeping master, Theodore. This gave Arthur the distraction he needed to run toward his father. His father was a Tier 4 class holder, someone far beyond the reach of these cultists. The plan appeared simple. If Arthur could awaken him, the battle would be decided. Yet as he sprinted forward, more cultists appeared behind him. They will not make this easy. If I keep going, they might reach Father before I can place the bracelet on him and his guards. Arthur realized he had to change his plan. He felt no love for his father, but he could not deny his strength. Their only real chance of survival was to awaken him, since the number of opponents seemed endless. Arthur could not understand where the cultists had found so many Tier 3 class holders, but they kept coming without end. Very well. I will take care of you first. He stopped and turned to face the enemy closing in behind him. With only one before him, his skill activated again, and the duel began. In the distance, he glimpsed the others locked in combat. He could only hope Roland would come to his aid, for more enemies were appearing on the horizon with every moment. This doesn't look good. What's with this large-scale barrier outside? Roland thought to himself as he struck one of the spider-like legs. By now, he had managed to stall the witch. She could not inflict serious damage on him, yet he could do little against her either. Her regenerative power was overwhelming, and every wound she suffered released more acid that steadily ate away at his weapons. This was the reason he had chosen massive maces, since even if their shape was worn down, they could still serve as effective tools of war. His visor lit up as he watched the feed from one of his floating golems. He had released them into the air in hopes of understanding the situation. The original plan had been to call for aid from the people outside the palace. The cultist relics were powerful and would affect anyone entering from outside as well, yet they still had limits. If enough people came inside, the spell would begin to waver and might allow him to break it without destroying the relics. However, he had underestimated his enemies, and this was no longer possible. The entire area outside the main castle was sealed within a massive invisible shield. The cult had seized control of it, and his golems could not break through. From the outside, no one would notice even if one of the towers collapsed and smoke filled the sky. It was now clear that they would either need to destroy the relics or focus on saving the Duke. Redirect the drones to reconnaissance. Where are the relics hidden? What is the meaning of this? I will not let you deny me my victory. As he focused on his visor, the witch struck. Her body had fully morphed into a grotesque fusion of Black Widow, Scorpion, and human. To make matters worse, she possessed two tails, each ending in a stinger that secreted a different substance. Together, they ate away at his shields, layer by layer. Do you think I do not know where your precious relics are? Do you think you can hide them from me? He answered calmly while slamming one of the tails with his mace until it cracked under the force. The weapon itself split in return, but his magic held it together. The monster screamed in pain yet pressed on, relentless. You will not ruin my ascension. I will dream alongside the Lord. By now, Roland knew of the being they worshipped, the Abyssal God. It went by many names, and some called it the Living Nightmare. He understood why. The cultists resembled the ones he had fought before, yet each was twisted in a unique way. Their bodies seemed shaped from fear itself, spiders, tentacles, and other grotesque forms that filled people's dreams. Connection established. Finally. Roland was not someone who grew emotional often, but when he saw the small line of text on his visor, he felt relief. Without turning around, he glanced through one of his floating golems. Through it, he could see that Arthur had finally reached the Duke. The bracelet Roland had given him was now on the Duke's wrist, which meant the counterattack could finally begin. Now then. After establishing the link, Roland repeated the same procedure he had used with the others. By using the Duke's mana pattern, he could produce a wake-up signal and block out the resonance of the relic. It only took a few moments, and soon the bracelet on the Duke's hand began to shine. Is it as I predicted? I wish I had been wrong about this one. Roland bit his lip as he noticed something troubling. Even after the bracelet was activated, the Duke did not rise. Arthur gently shook him and called out, but the man remained asleep. Fat. I mean, Your Grace, you need to wake up. We need your aid. Can you hear me? The Duke only gave a faint grunt. He seemed barely conscious and in no condition to fight. Haha. Was that your glorious plan? The witch grinned with both her mouths as she watched their futile attempt to rouse the Duke. Even if you wake him, he will not help you. What did you do to him? Does it matter? You shall all die today and join me in the everlasting dream. Now surrender yourselves to the abyss. Her words made little sense, but Roland could piece together the truth. The Duke had likely been poisoned or struck by some disease. The cult was almost certainly behind it, emboldened enough by this advantage to launch their assault. Everything fit together now. They were confident of victory, and with several Tier 3 class holders on their side, it was clear that they had invested a great deal into this plan. Failure was not something they intended to allow. Roland had known that something was wrong with the Duke's health, but he had not imagined it would be this severe. The Duke was still a Tier 4 powerhouse, and Roland had assumed he would at least be able to handle this situation. Now it seemed, as it had so many times before, that the burden of escaping this predicament rested on his shoulders again. To make matters worse, another fact had been confirmed. Arthur possessed another free bracelet, and it had already found its way onto the arm of one of the guards. To Roland's surprise, the man who appeared to be the guard captain was unexpectedly weak, more like someone who had only recently become a Tier 3 class holder rather than someone entrusted with protecting an injured duke. It was strange, yet at that moment, he had no time to dwell on the reason, as he needed to focus on the battle before him. He had a hunch that the strongest warriors were those who had arrived with Arthur's brothers. Perhaps the true Knights of Power were indisposed for some reason, and the most likely cause was the cult. It had already managed to poison the Duke himself, so his finest warriors might have fallen to the same fate. This meant Roland could rely only on himself and the few people still present. No one would come to their aid until the relics stopped sending out their ominous signal, and it was up to him and Arthur to succeed. Multiple decahedron-shaped devices hovered through the air, glowing brightly as they released concentrated blue beams of mana. The beams collided with an invisible wall that did not ripple or falter against the intense magical light. After a moment, the floating constructs ceased their assault and instead began to circle the area. They spread apart, sweeping across the endless grounds of the outer palace. In the distance, the sounds of battle echoed, accompanied by strange shrieks that resembled monstrous cries. The earth trembled briefly as something massive clashed, yet the devices pressed on with their new task. Soon one of them drifted into a large watchtower, its artificial eye narrowing as it focused on an anomaly. The golem paused, observing a cloaked figure seated before a small obelisk. The object was an abyssal relic placed upon the ground within an occult circle. Symbols covered the floor, and at the center of a pentagram, the relic rested. As the construct advanced, a sudden swishing sound cut through the air, and its metallic body was sliced cleanly in two. From the side emerged a monstrous creature resembling a mantis, its bladed arms retracting after striking the construct. For a moment, several more of the same creatures appeared, standing guard around the cloaked man and the obelisk before him. There you are! Roland thought to himself as he analyzed the footage from his defeated drone. It had captured an image of a cultist meditating or praying in front of the relic. The man was inside one of the watchtowers, and Roland's other drones quickly confirmed that all 6 towers were emitting a signal. If he hoped to awaken everyone in the castle, he would need to destroy every one of them. The targets are there, but... At the moment, Roland was locked in a fight with a powerful witch. Even when he used several of his magic tricks, his opponent managed to shrug them off. The armor he wore was designed mainly for defense and physical damage, but this enemy resisted both with ease. Matters grew worse as multiple cultists swarmed in from outside. Roland could not understand how they had entered without being noticed. Because he was unable to use a proper runic suit, his scanning capabilities were limited. If he had been wearing the right suit and not concealing his full abilities, he might have prevented this situation. The woman responsible had stood among them all the time, but her disguise had seemed unbreakable. Only after he struck her with a heavy blow did the occult energies begin to seep through, and by then it was too late. Arthur! What is it? I am busy over here. I know where the other relics are, but I am not sure I can reach them on my own. What do you need me to do? Arthur was locked in a defensive fight as well. The Duke wore a bracelet, and so did one of his personal knights, but that was the extent of their preparations. Roland had crafted several bracelets for such an occasion, yet he had not imagined the situation would become this dire. The cult had gone further than he believed possible, and he never expected 7 relics to be activated at once, each discharging a signal in a different location. He had assumed that disabling a single relic would be enough to end this kind of threat. To make matters worse, his plan for the Duke to eliminate the enemies had failed, and now they even had to defend the man from harm. There were several ways Roland could approach the situation, and much seemed to depend on him. The people he had awakened had no clear understanding of what was happening, and there was no guarantee they would cooperate. The man guarding Theodore would probably remain inactive, which made it fortunate that Arthur had chosen not to awaken his second brother. As a result, the large man was forced to fight off the cultists, who focused on attacking anyone who had awakened from the illusory dream. For now, the nobles who had fallen under the spell were ignored and remained gathered in a few locations. The grand hall was spacious, and Arthur and the others had moved to a side area where no people were present. It made things a bit simpler as he didn't need to defend the other nobles, but eventually their lives would probably be at risk. Taking out the towers by himself was possible, but he did not know what would happen to the people here if he stormed out. If the witch decided to chase after him, then things could be fine. If not, Arthur might be in danger. This cultist was powerful enough that he was not sure he would emerge from their confrontation unscathed. To minimize the damage, it was best if the monsters focused on him instead. For that, he would need to convince them that he was the most important target, not the weakened Duke himself. I will take this battle outside. You need to convince the others to help you take down the cultists at the watchtowers. Each one has a relic, and they must be destroyed. But I am not sure I can achieve this alone. Arthur replied, hiding behind the knight commanders his brothers commanded. Lady Bernadette was cutting through the monsters, and so was the bestial warden. Both were much stronger than he was and far more suited to the task. I know. Lady Bernadette will probably help you, as will the mage who came with Tybalt. They are your most likely allies. If they refuse, I know how to persuade them. Very well. Just be careful, my friend. I will. A semblance of a plan had been formed, but now it was time to carry it out. The first step was to drive this monstrous witch out of the Grand Hall and into the open, where he could unleash his full power without the risk of the castle collapsing on everyone inside. Roland slammed both maces into the marble floor, releasing a burst of concussive force. The shockwave shoved the witch back for a moment, giving him just enough time to take aim. Keeping his center of gravity low, he launched forward. From his back, a surge of energy burst out and propelled him with explosive speed. All four of his shields snapped into position, intercepting the counterattack that came his way. He did not stop. His charge carried him straight into the massive armored arachnoid body of his opponent, slamming her into the wall. The impact was immense, fueled by a large portion of his mana. Though the wall was built to endure, cracks spread across its surface until, with a thunderous crash, both combatants broke through and spilled into the open air outside. The two combatants tumbled into the outer courtyard, rubble cascading around them as the witch's shriek rattled the night. Roland staggered to his feet, his armor dented, but his visor still shone with streams of tactical data. The witch scuttled up the side of the broken wall, her malformed limb stabbing into the stone as her eyes glowed with abyssal fury. It matters not what you do, my victory is all but assured. The witch screamed at him as she stood. In her eyes, he had already lost, and at first glance, it seemed true. His armor was cracked, his shields partially melted, and even his weapons showed signs of damage. The monster before him, however, remained uninjured. Her form regenerated endlessly, as though defeating her was impossible. You think so? Roland activated a new sequence. Circles of light spun into place around his arms and shoulders, and his fractured maces and armor parts reconstructed themselves through raw mana. The witch stared in disbelief as his armor reformed piece by piece. As you can see, you are not the only one who can regenerate. This battle is far from over. The woman screeched at him. It matters not, the Duke will die. My flock will see to that. Are you sure you should be worrying about the Duke? Are you not forgetting something? The cultist's mouths twisted in confusion. She followed his gaze upward and saw multiple floating constructs surrounding the 6 watchtowers where the relics were held. Stop stalling. Those things cannot destroy the sacred relics. Are you sure about that? Did I actually have to destroy the last one? He forced a laugh to plant doubt in her mind. She still remembered how he had disabled the relic in her possession, and that memory was the seed he wanted to grow. He needed her to see him as the greatest threat here, otherwise, his plan would fail. He had no way to disable all of the relics quickly while fighting her, but she did not know that. No, that is impossible, the sacred relics are. Before she could finish, he cut her off. Are what? Infallible and perfect? We both know that is not true. I disabled this so-called dream of yours once, and I will do it again. Once the barrier falls, the Duke's armies will flood in. It does not matter if he survives, so go ahead, target him instead. Roland wondered if his provocation had been too obvious, but the cultist was far from sane. Her twisted body made her reckless, and it seemed his ruse was beginning to take hold. To sell it better, he even had his golems glow in a radiant light above the towers as if they were doing something. Once my golems figure out the resonance, that relic of yours will be nothing more than scrap. No, I won't let you. The witch let out a piercing shriek that split the night like glass. Her many eyes glowed with a violent shade of violet, and miasma spilled from every pore of her corrupted flesh. The cloud thickened around her body, roiling like smoke, yet it was something far more sinister. The ground beneath her was covered with plant matter, mostly grass, and as soon as the mist appeared, all vegetation began to wither and die. Good thing I led her out of the grand hall, otherwise everyone would have been killed. Roland leapt back while analyzing the airborne toxin. He could withstand it for a short while, but his armor was not designed to resist such corruption indefinitely. The destructive and corrosive properties were obvious, but the witch's outburst did not end there. She continued to howl into the night like a werewolf. Suddenly, signals appeared from below. What? More of them were hiding. The sudden emergence caught him off guard. He could not understand how the cultists had managed to conceal themselves from his sensors, but within moments, countless hands burst from the ground. For an instant, he wondered if he was dealing with a necromancer summoning zombies, but one look at the creatures revealed something far more disturbing. They were unlike the cultists he had encountered inside the building. Their forms leaned closer to humanoid than insectoid, and their heads were consumed by writhing masses of tentacles with eyes scattered across them. Abyssal Ghoul L-129. These were advanced zombie-type monsters that had been overtaken by the abyss. Fortunately, their levels were not especially high compared to his own, yet, what they lacked in strength, they compensated for with sheer numbers. The entire area was soon swarming with them. To make matters worse, many of the cultists who had been inside the grand hall now poured outside and focused all of their killing intent on him, which was exactly what he had been hoping for. Good. I just hope those guys can work together. Before the tide of ghouls and cultists could pour into the courtyard where he stood, he chose to act. His visor displayed hundreds of signatures, and his HUD flashed warnings faster than he could tag them. Yet he did not despair, for he still had a few aces up his sleeve. He loosened his grip on one of his maces and dropped to one knee. His armored hand pressed against the ground, and a great circle spread out from beneath him. His magical power surged in all directions, and his onyx armor began to glow. Before the mass of monsters could surround him, a towering column nearly 10 meters wide rose into the air. This armor was not merely built for defense. Aligned with the element of earth, it allowed him to reshape the ground itself. Jagged spikes thrust upward from the courtyard, blocking the ghouls from charging him all at once. To tilt the battle further in his favor, he summoned reinforcements. Spatial runes opened around him, releasing what they could. Golems marched forward, some fashioned in the likeness of spiders and others formed of hardened stone that mirrored the armor he wore. You are not the only one with minions. This was always meant to be a defensive battle, and he had prepared for it. The ground was reshaping into a makeshift fortress of hardened stone wrought by his magic. Golems with ranged capabilities, such as his cannon spider constructs, clung to the rising pillars and opened fire from above. The larger rock golems engaged the ghouls directly, their sheer size keeping the tide of monsters at bay. The struggle of attrition had begun, and all he could do was hope his allies carried out the other part of the plan while he held back the enemy. You want us to do what? We need to reach the towers. Unless we destroy those relics. Before Arthur could continue, his brother Julius raised a hand in protest. I disagree. We should leave this place and take father with us. Your knight is a brave man, but we should use this chance to retreat. Arthur frowned at the words. Only moments ago, they had been fighting side by side against the cultists, but now in this brief pause, Julius was already looking for a way out. Roland had managed to draw off most of the enemy force, yet Arthur knew it was only temporary. His brothers showed no desire to press the advantage. Instead, they clung to their own safety and to their father's, which Arthur suspected was little more than an excuse to abandon the fight. I see. Then perhaps Lady Bernadette will see the light. I thought paladins of Solaria were supposed to destroy cultist filth, yet you seem to tuck your tail and run while people suffer. Arthur's words landed sharply, and his voice trembled. Julius did not like the accusation that he was running away, but Arthur was not speaking to him. His gaze was fixed on Bernadette. Her great blade glowed with a golden aura, burning through the blood of the abyssal cultists it had just slain. Your brother speaks the truth. As a high paladin of Solaria, I cannot ignore this. Young lord, you seem to know the way. Lead me and I shall be your blade. To his surprise, the paladin woman did not even protest. Roland had been right about her. Once relics and the cult were mentioned, she was ready. She showed no concern for Julius' well-being, as if she fully expected him to defend himself. Lady Bernadette, I am not sure you should. Young Julius, the radiant sun compels me to act. Stay here and protect your kin while I resolve this matter. Do not fear, a few cultists cannot defeat me. The sun is with us, we shan't be defeated. I understand. Julius nodded, and Arthur smiled. He had secured one ally, leaving only one more to persuade. He had already given up on the larger man, who might have been even stronger than Bernadette but would never leave while Theodore remained. Master Anzinous, would you be willing to aid us as well? We could use a mage of your power. Tibaltzaid was an elderly wizard. He looked to be in his 60s, with a full beard and a tall hat pulled low over his brow. His robes hung loosely, yet the mana that surrounded him was immense. Me? Preposterous. If I had known this would happen, I never would have agreed to come. Arthur was taken aback. Tibaltzaid did not seem loyal at all. It was as though his brothers had merely paid these people at a high price without ever earning their allegiance. Now it fell to Arthur to convince the mage. Fortunately, he still had Roland on his side. As the conversation began, the golem floating above him moved. From within, Roland's voice resounded. Great Wizard Anzinous, I am sure we can reach an understanding. I know what you desire, and if you aid us today, I will see it done.